Welcome, and thank you for being here. Tonight we are going to explore something that most people who love Spider-Man have sensed but rarely heard spoken aloud: the hidden weight beneath the heroism, the private cost of a public mission, the truths that Peter Parker carries through every swing across the Manhattan skyline and every quiet evening at home with the people he loves. This is not a story about battles or villains, though both will appear in their time. It is a story about what it actually costs to be extraordinary in secret, to love people you cannot fully protect, and to spend a lifetime honouring a lesson learned at the highest possible price. So settle in, let your breath slow, and allow the story to come to you gently, without urgency, without rush. There is nowhere else to be tonight. Only here, in the quiet, where the real story of Spider-Man has always been waiting to be told. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no name in most languages. The loneliness of someone who is surrounded by people who care about them, and who cannot, for reasons that are simultaneously urgent and impossible to explain, tell those people the most important thing that has ever happened to them. It is not the loneliness of abandonment or neglect. It is something stranger and in certain ways more isolating than either of those, because it exists inside warmth and love and daily connection, invisible to everyone, felt only by the person carrying it. This is the loneliness that settled over Peter Benjamin Parker in the weeks and months following a Tuesday afternoon in November, when a spider descended from its enclosure at a university laboratory and changed the direction of his life forever. And it is the loneliness that would, in one form or another, remain with him for the rest of his days. He was 15 years old when it began, a boy who had already accumulated more than his share of the particular sorrows that adolescence can produce in someone who is too intelligent for easy social comfort and too kind-hearted for the protective armour of indifference. He lived in Queens, in a small house that smelled of May Parker's cooking and Ben Parker's workshop oil, a house that was modest in its dimensions and enormous in its warmth, the kind of home that people remember all their lives not because of its size or its furnishings, but because of the quality of attention that filled it. Ben and May had raised Peter since he was very small, since the death of his parents Richard and Mary in circumstances that Peter understood only in outline, and they had done so with the quiet generosity of people who regard love not as a sacrifice but as a privilege. Peter's life before the spider bite was, by the standards of the world that surrounded him, not a happy one in any conventional sense. At Midtown High School he occupied the invisible middle territory between the students who were celebrated and the students who were actively persecuted, though the line between those categories shifted regularly in his direction. Flash Thompson, who was tall and confident and genuinely beloved by the social machinery of the school, had made Peter into something of a recurring amusement, not out of any particular cruelty of character, but out of the casual thoughtlessness of someone who has never needed to consider what it costs another person to be the subject of a joke. The name-calling was routine, the shoves in the hallway were routine, the laughter at his expense during lunch, the exclusion from conversations and invitations. The way his very presence seemed to generate a kind of social weather that pushed other students away from proximity to him. All of this was routine, unremarkable, simply the texture of his days. What made Peter different from many young people in his position was not his ability to endure this treatment, which was remarkable in itself, but his refusal to be defined by it. In the privacy of his bedroom, surrounded by science textbooks and astronomy magazines and the careful notes of experiments he wanted to try, Peter Parker was someone else entirely. Curious, exhilarated, deeply engaged with the world, at a level that the hallways of Midtown High never gave him room to express. His teachers recognized it, even when they could not quite articulate what they were seeing, this quality of attention that distinguished him from students who were merely clever. He did not just learn things, he wanted to understand them, wanted to follow the thread of an idea all the way back to its source, and then forward again into its consequences, wanted to know not only what was true, but why it was true, and what it meant that it was true. This was the boy who was bitten by the radioactive spider. This was the boy who woke the following morning to discover that the world had changed shape around him, that his hands could hold his own weight against any surface, that his senses had expanded into territories that had no previous referent in his experience, that his body had become something genuinely new in the history of the world. And this was the boy who had absolutely no one to tell. The silence that Peter maintained in the immediate aftermath of the bite was not a considered strategy. It was instinct, the same instinct that had kept him from sharing most of his inner life with the people around him for the entirety of his adolescence. He had learned. Through years of small social experiments whose results were never encouraging, that the things he found most interesting and most important were not the things that other people wanted to hear about, the science that excited him, the moral questions that kept him awake at night, the books he read and the ideas they generated. None of these had ever opened doors for him in the social world of his school, and so he had gradually constructed the habit of compartmentalization, of keeping the interior life separate from the presented surface. Adding one more secret to this existing architecture of privacy felt, in the disoriented days following the bite, almost natural. But this secret was categorically different from anything he had kept before. The powers he had gained were not a private interest or a personal enthusiasm. They were a physical reality, present in every interaction and every moment, requiring constant management and concealment in ways that his previous secrets never had. When he walked through the kitchen in the morning, he had to think about how hard he was gripping his coffee cup. When he sat beside other students in class, he had to consciously moderate his response to the enhanced sensory information flooding in from every direction. The conversations happening 2 rooms away, the heartbeats of people near him, the granular texture of surfaces that his fingertips could now read like language. When Flash Thompson shoved him in the hallway, and Peter felt the familiar rush of his enhanced reflexes responding, he had to make an active choice, in the span of less than a second, not to respond with the full force of what he'd become. This constant management, this perpetual performance of being less than he was, had a cost that accumulated quietly in the background of everything else he was experiencing. To be 15 years old and to have discovered something extraordinary about yourself, to feel the potential of it in every cell of your body, and to have nowhere to put that discovery, no one to share it with, no context in which it could be celebrated or even simply acknowledged. This was a particular kind of pressure that most people never experience, and that the young man who had become Spider-Man felt every single day from the moment he woke, until the moment he finally allowed himself to rest. Aunt May noticed, of course, in the way that women who have loved children carefully for years notice everything, not with any specificity but with the general awareness that something had shifted in her nephew's interior weather. She asked gentle questions over dinner, watched him with the alert attention of someone who is tracking a variable she cannot quite identify, made his favourite meals with an increased frequency that was her particular idiom of concern. Peter answered her questions with the affectionate vagueness that had become his conversational default, and felt, each time he did so, the specific small grief of deceiving someone who loved him and deserved better. Uncle Ben's approach was different. Ben Parker was not a man who pried, not because he was incurious about Peter's inner life, but because he had a profound respect for the privacy of other people's inner lives, a respect that expressed itself in patience, in availability, in the gentle consistency of his presence. He was there when Peter needed him, visibly and warmly there, and he asked no questions that Peter was not ready to answer. What he offered instead were the conversations that he had always offered, about fairness, about responsibility, about the difference between what a person could do and what a person ought to do, delivered not as lectures but as reflections, as thinking done aloud in the company of someone he trusted. Peter listened to these conversations with a new quality of attention in the weeks following the bite, hearing in them something that he had perhaps always registered at a level beneath conscious articulation, that Ben was trying to teach him something, and that the lesson mattered in ways that extended far beyond any particular circumstance Ben might have had in mind when he offered it. Into this complicated private landscape came the wrestling match and the television appearances, which represented something more psychologically significant than simple opportunism. When Peter saw the advertisement promising prize money to anyone who could survive 3 minutes in the ring with Crusher Hogan, his first response was not calculation. It was relief. Here, finally, was somewhere he could be what he actually was. Here was a context in which the strength and speed and agility that he had been so carefully hiding could exist openly, wrapped in a costume that separated Spider-Man from Peter Parker, freed from the exhausting performance of ordinariness. The prize money was real, and he needed it. and the scientific part of his mind appreciated the opportunity to test the parameters of his new abilities in a controlled environment. But beneath all of that was something simpler and more human, the deep desire of a person who has always been invisible to be, even briefly seen. The crowd's response when he entered the ring was predictable and irrelevant to what he found there. Within those few minutes of genuine physical expression, Peter Parker experienced something he had not felt since before the bite transformed him, which was the uncomplicated pleasure of being exactly what he was without apology or concealment. Spider-Man on that wrestling mat was not performing anything. Spider-Man was simply present, and the freedom of that presence was intoxicating in a way that went beyond the crowd's eventual astonishment and the prize money folded into his hand afterward. The television appearance that followed extended this freedom into a larger arena and added to it the unfamiliar warmth of public admiration, of being praised and celebrated by strangers who had no prior investment in the awkward, overlooked teenager from Queens. The producer's enthusiasm, the studio audience's delight, the host's generous treatment of the masked young hero, all of this reached something in Peter that had been waiting a very long time to be reached. He walked out of that studio with more money than he had ever earned, and with the first genuine sense he had ever had that his abilities might be a pathway towards something other than the life he had been living, something better, something that recognized his worth in the world. It is important to hold this in mind as the story moves toward its first great darkness. The boy who let the thief run past him in that studio corridor was not a bad person. He was a 15-year-old who had spent years being overlooked and dismissed, who had just discovered that he possessed extraordinary gifts, and who had begun to believe, reasonably and understandably, that those gifts were his to use as he saw fit. The decision to step aside, to tell the security guard that catching criminals was not his job, came from a place of accumulated hurt and newfound self-regard that deserved, even as it produced catastrophe, to be understood rather than simply condemned. The universe was about to administer the most devastating correction in the history of its many corrections, and Peter Parker would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of what that correction cost. But the boy who made the mistake was not a villain. He was simply a teenager who had not yet understood the full shape of the responsibility he had been given. The call that came a few evenings later, the phone ringing downstairs while Peter sat with his homework, Aunt May's voice changing register, in the way that voices change when the world has shifted. That call ended one chapter of Peter Parker's life so completely that everything that followed it was defined, in one way or another, by what he learned in the hours after he heard it. The thief he had let walk past him had gone on to rob a warehouse where Ben Parker was working a night security shift. Ben had tried to stop him. The thief had not wanted to be stopped. And the man who had offered Peter the most consistent love and moral clarity of his life was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital. The discovery at the waterfront warehouse, the recognition of the face behind the criminal's defiance, the shattering arithmetic of cause and effect closing around him in that moment, these things broke something in Peter Parker that did not fully heal, that perhaps was never meant to fully heal, because the fracture itself became the foundation of everything he built afterward. The grief was real, and it was total. But beneath the grief, almost immediately, was the understanding that had been waiting for him in Ben's quiet conversations all along, the understanding that the ability to help creates the obligation to help, that power exercised only in the service of the self is not power, but a kind of theft from everyone who needed it and did not have it. He had been given something extraordinary. He had used it to stand aside, and a good man was dead. Spider-Man was born in that warehouse in the way that the most enduring things are born, not from triumph or inspiration, but from the particular clarity that only profound failure can produce. The costume he would refine in the weeks that followed, the web shooters he would engineer with the same scientific precision that had always been his greatest gift, the daily practice of patrol and protection that would become the rhythm of his life. All of these things had their true origin not in the laboratory at the university or the wrestling ring or the television studio, but in the moment when Peter Parker looked at a criminal's face and understood exactly what his selfishness had cost. He would spend the rest of his life making payments on that debt, not out of punishment, not out of the mechanical repetition of guilt, but out of the genuine conviction that had crystallized in him in that instant, that with great power comes great responsibility, and that this was not a sentiment or a suggestion, but the deepest truth he had ever encountered, written into him now at a level that nothing could erase. What no one around him understood, what Aunt May in her grief and his teachers in their concern and his classmates in their obliviousness could not possibly have known, was that the slightly quieter, more serious, increasingly absent teenager who moved through the weeks following Ben's funeral was not the same person who had entered them. He had been remade by grief and recognition into someone who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he was for, and who was carrying that knowledge entirely alone into a life that would never again be simple or separate or free from the weight of what it meant to be Spider-Man. The lesson that broke Peter Parker open and remade him into something new did not arrive without warning. It arrived, as the most important lessons often do, wrapped in the ordinary texture of a life that seemed, from the outside, to be proceeding more or less as lives proceed, with their small dailiness and their familiar rhythms and their unremarkable passage of one day into the next. The warning had been present for years, offered quietly and consistently by the man who had raised him, woven into the fabric of conversations that Peter had absorbed without fully understanding, the way children absorb the deepest truths of their upbringing long before they possess the experience to recognize what they have been given. Benjamin Parker had been trying to teach his nephew something essential for as long as Peter could remember. The tragedy is not that Peter failed to listen. The tragedy is that he listened perfectly, understood everything, and had simply not yet lived enough to know what the words actually meant. Ben Parker deserves to be held in the fullness of who he was before the story moves toward the night that ended his life, because the tendency in the telling of this particular story is to reduce him to a function, to make him the death that made the hero, the loss that generated the lesson, as though his entire existence were a narrative device arranged by the universe for Peter's moral education. He was not that. He was a man, specific and irreducible, possessed of qualities that had nothing to do with his nephew's transformation, and everything to do with his own long and quietly dignified life. Benjamin Parker had worked with his hands for most of his adult years, the kind of work that leaves its evidence in the body, in the particular way a man carries himself, in the steadiness of his grip and the patience of his attention. He had never accumulated wealth or professional distinction in any form that the world recognized, and he had, as far as anyone who knew him could tell, made his peace with this completely, without bitterness, without the corrosive comparison to other lives that poisons so many people who feel they have been underserved by their circumstances. He fixed things. He fixed the neighbours' appliances when they could not afford a professional. He fixed the loose steps on the front porch every spring. He fixed the minor mechanical failures of a modest life with the same focused attention that he brought to larger problems, and he did all of this without expectation of recognition, because the work itself was the point. The helping itself was the reward, and this was simply how he had decided to live. His workshop in the basement of the house on Ingram Street was a room that told you everything important about the man who inhabited it. It was cluttered in the way that genuinely useful spaces are cluttered, not with neglect but with active engagement, with projects in various stages of completion, with tools hung on pegboards and labelled in Ben's careful hand, with the accumulated materials of a person who believed that broken things were worth fixing, and that the effort of repair was always preferable to the convenience of replacement. Peter had spent hours in that workshop across the years of his childhood, perched on a stool and watching his uncle's hands move over whatever needed attention, and it was in those hours, perhaps more than anywhere else, that the deepest part of Ben Parker's teaching had settled into him. Ben talked while he worked, not in the way of someone filling silence, but in the way of someone who thought better with his hands occupied, who found that the rhythm of useful labour loosened something in his mind and allowed him to say things that might otherwise have stayed interior. He talked about fairness and what it asked of people who had been given advantages they had not earned. He talked about the difference between the strength that intimidates and the strength that protects, and how the first kind was always ultimately lonely and the second kind was always ultimately sustaining. He talked about what he called the peculiar privilege of being capable, the way that the ability to help someone places you in a relationship with that person, whether you acknowledge it or not, and how the choice to ignore that relationship is itself a choice, one that leaves a mark on the person who makes it. Peter, sitting on his stool and listening with the half-attention of a child who does not yet know that he is being educated, absorbed all of this into the substrate of himself, into the part of a person that holds the things they know before they know them. The specific phrase that became the cornerstone of Spider-Man's entire moral architecture was offered by Ben in the unassuming way he offered most important things, as a passing observation rather than a formal lesson, as something he was simply noticing aloud rather than declaring. They had been talking about something else entirely, something small and everyday, and Ben had said it almost as a parenthetical, that with great power comes great responsibility, said it, and moved on and left it to settle into Peter in whatever way it would settle. Peter had nodded and said something appropriate and filed the phrase away in the vast interior library of things his uncle had said that he understood intellectually and had not yet been required to understand in the full embodied sense of understanding that can only come from experience. He would have many years to revisit that moment and trace the exact shape of what it had been trying to give him. In the weeks following the spider bite, when Peter was managing his new powers with the intensity and secrecy described earlier, Ben's conversations continued in their usual form and frequency, and Peter listened to them with a new quality of attention that he would not have been able to explain if asked. Something in the transformation he had undergone had sharpened his awareness of his uncle in a way that felt, in retrospect, like premonition, though it was almost certainly nothing more than the natural heightening of perception that comes with the opening of new sensory channels. He noticed the specific texture of Ben's voice in the evenings, the way the light from the kitchen window caught the grey at his temples, the particular warmth of his hand on Peter's shoulder when he said goodnight. He was paying attention, more attention than he had perhaps ever paid to anything, and what he was paying attention to was a man who would be gone before he had a chance to tell him what that attention meant. The night that Ben Parker died had an ordinary beginning of the kind that makes what followed feel even more violent in its rupture of the expected. Peter had been in his room, occupied with the twin pressures of homework and planning, because the television appearance had generated an offer for a follow-up engagement, and Peter was considering the logistics with the focused pleasure he brought to any problem that seemed genuinely solvable. He was not thinking about his uncle. He was not thinking about responsibility or power or any of the things that would define every moment of the rest of his life. He was a teenager with a plan and a future that seemed, for the first time, to be opening towards something genuinely good, and the ordinariness of that moment, the homework on the desk and the notes about the upcoming appearance, and the sense of forward momentum makes what followed feel, even decades later, even in the telling, like an act of particular cruelty on the part of the universe. The phone rang and May answered it, and the world changed. The drive to the hospital contained the particular quality of time that emergency produces, the way that minutes stretch and compress simultaneously, the way that the mind runs ahead to conclusions it is not prepared to reach, while the body continues the mechanical business of movement and function. May sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded around her purse, in a grip that was not quite composed, whispering things under her breath that were addressed somewhere beyond the interior of the car. Peter drove and kept his eyes on the road and felt, in his chest, the first intimation of something that his spider sense, however enhanced and accurate it had become in the weeks since the bite, was entirely unable to detect or warn him against. The approach of a grief that would reshape the entire landscape of his interior life. The doctor at the hospital used the careful, practiced language that doctors use when they have delivered this particular news many times and have learned that directness is more merciful than circling, and what the words meant was that Benjamin Parker had been shot by an intruder at the warehouse where he worked night security, and that he had died before the medical staff could intervene, and that there was nothing anyone could have done differently in the time available. May made a sound that Peter had never heard from her before and would never forget, a sound that belonged to a register of human suffering that most people are fortunate enough to encounter only rarely. Peter held her and felt the inadequacy of holding, the way that the body's attempt to offer comfort through proximity becomes almost meaningless in the face of certain kinds of pain, and he held her anyway because it was the only thing available to him in that moment, the only gesture his hands knew how to make. The rage came later, and it came fast, rising through the grief the way heat rises through water, reaching the surface before the grief itself had fully registered. It was not an ignoble rage. It was the rage of someone who loved a good man and had watched that good man taken from the world by someone who had no right to take him, and it demanded something, demanded action, demanded that the power Peter had been given, and had been carefully tending and experimenting with in secret, be turned toward the thing it was actually capable of. Finding the person responsible and ensuring they faced a consequence proportional to what they had done. He changed into the costume in a hospital bathroom, excusing himself from May's side with a murmured explanation that did not hold up to scrutiny, but that she was in no condition to scrutinize. He moved through the city with a focused intensity that was different from the exhilaration of the wrestling match or the pleasure of the television appearance, something colder and more directed, and his enhanced senses and his web lines carried him toward the waterfront with a speed that the grief in his chest could not slow. He was looking for the person who had killed his uncle. He intended to find them. What he found instead was the beginning of his real education. The criminal had taken refuge in a waterfront warehouse, the kind of building that the city accumulated along its edges, large and dark and full of the particular silence of spaces that are not meant for habitation. Peter moved through it with the ease of someone whose body now understood architecture differently than it had 3 weeks earlier, scaling walls and crossing distances that would have been impassable before the bite. And when he found the man he was looking for, he found him in the posture of someone who believed himself safe, counting money in the shadows, apparently unconcerned with the life he had ended in order to obtain it. The confrontation was brief. It was not supposed to be the point. The point was the recognition that followed it. The moment when the criminal turned toward Peter with something in his expression that shifted from defiance to confusion to a peculiar uncertainty, and Peter looked at his face and understood, with a completeness that arrived before his conscious mind had assembled the evidence, that he had seen this face before, not in a wanted poster or a photograph, in a corridor, in a television studio. Standing between Peter Parker and the elevator while a security guard shouted for someone to stop him, and Peter had stepped aside. The weight of what this meant did not arrive gradually. It arrived all at once, the full architecture of cause and effect assembling itself in his mind in the space of a single breath, and what it showed him was a map he could not unsee. His choice, the thief's freedom, the warehouse, his uncle's life, the ground between them connecting everything in a chain so simple and so terrible that it felt almost like a joke, the kind of joke that the universe tells at the expense of people who have not yet understood the rules. He had let this man go. He had let this man go because catching criminals was not his job, because he was an entertainer, because the powerful new gifts he had been given were his to use as he saw fit, and he had decided, standing in that corridor, that his comfort and his ambitions were more important than the abstract suffering of strangers, and his uncle was dead. There is a difference between knowing something and understanding it, and the distinction lies precisely in the body, in the place where knowledge becomes something you carry rather than something you hold. Peter had known, in the intellectual sense, everything that Ben's quiet workshop conversations had been trying to convey. He had known that capability creates obligation. He had known that the choice to ignore someone's need when you have the power to meet it is itself a moral act with moral consequences. He had known all of this the way a person knows the rules of a game they have never played, as an abstraction, correct in its outlines but weightless, unconnected to the actual texture of lived experience. He understood it now in the other sense, in the sense that would never leave him, in the sense that arrived through his body rather than his mind, and settled into him like something structural, like something that was now simply part of what he was made of. The criminal was turned over to the police, webbed and evidenced and available for the legal consequences that the law would determine. Peter did not deliver additional punishment. The rage that had driven him across the city did not translate in the moment into the violence it had promised, and this restraint, which cost him enormously in that instant and would cost him in different ways for years afterward, was perhaps the first genuine act of Spider-Man. The first choice he made as the hero he was becoming rather than the grieving teenager he also still was. He walked home through the streets of Queens in his crude costume and with his uncle's absence beside him like a presence, and he understood with the completeness of someone who has paid for understanding with the most irreplaceable currency available that he would not make the same choice again. The grief and the guilt were not the same thing, though they arrived together and lived together, and were sometimes difficult to distinguish in the weeks that followed. The grief for Ben was clean in the way that grief can be clean even when it is enormous, the straightforward mourning of a person who loved someone and had that someone taken away. The guilt was more complicated, wound through with the specific texture of a failure that had been entirely avoidable, that had stemmed from a choice rather than a circumstance. That Peter could trace back along a clear and well-lit path to a moment in a corridor when he had known exactly what was being asked of him, and had decided that the asking did not apply. The guilt had a quality of permanence that the grief eventually would not, because grief softens over time as the mind learns to accommodate the shape of an absence, while the guilt for a preventable failure has no natural mechanism of resolution, no process by which it is metabolized into something less sharp. What Peter learned to do with this guilt across the years that followed was neither to deny it nor to be destroyed by it, but to transmute it, to use it as fuel for a commitment that was genuine rather than merely obligatory. That came from the deepest understanding he possessed of what his powers were actually for. Ben had been trying to tell him all along. The ability to help creates the obligation to help. The spider bite had not given Peter Parker a gift in any uncomplicated sense. It had given him a responsibility, enormous and ongoing and non-negotiable, and the price of learning this had been the life of the best man he had ever known. He would honour that price every night for the rest of his life. He would swing out over the city and catch the things that were falling and stand between the vulnerable and the danger that moved toward them. And he would do this not because it erased anything, or resolved anything, or made the accounting come out even in any way he could calculate, but because it was the right thing to do, because it was the only thing that made sense of what had happened, because Uncle Ben had known, in the quiet way that good people know the most important things, that his nephew had the capacity for genuine greatness, and that greatness of the kind Ben believed in had always looked exactly like this. Not power used for personal advancement or public admiration, but power placed quietly and consistently, and without expectation of reward in the service of everyone who needed it. The boy who walked home through Queens that night was carrying a grief that would not leave him, and a guilt that would never fully dissolve, and a purpose that was the clearest thing he had ever felt. He was 15 years old, and he understood, in the fullest possible sense of understanding, what he was for. Understanding what you are for is one thing. Living inside that understanding day after day, across the full breadth of an ordinary life that must continue to look ordinary from the outside, while containing something entirely extraordinary within. This is a different kind of challenge altogether. And it is one that Peter Parker faced every morning from the moment he opened his eyes until the moment he finally allowed himself to sleep, which was often later than anyone who knew him would have considered reasonable, and for reasons that none of them could have guessed. The clarity of purpose that arrived on the night of Ben's death was real, and it was sustaining, and it was also, in the most practical sense, enormously complicated to actually live inside. Because purpose, however genuine, does not resolve logistics. And the logistics of being Spider-Man while also being Peter Parker were, from the very beginning, staggering in their complexity and relentless in their daily demand. There is a version of the superhero life that exists in the imagination of people who have never had to think seriously about it, a version in which the hero changes into their costume, performs their heroics, changes back, and steps seamlessly into their civilian existence with nothing carried over from one identity to the other, except perhaps a pleasant glow of accomplishment. This version has essentially nothing to do with the life that Peter Parker actually lived. The life he actually lived required, from its earliest days, the construction and maintenance of an entire parallel architecture of explanation, excuse, misdirection, and carefully managed absence that was in certain respects as demanding as the heroics themselves, and that left its own particular kind of exhaustion in the body and the mind of the person maintaining it. Consider the simple matter of time. Spider-Man's work was not predictable. Crimes did not schedule themselves around Peter's existing commitments. A mugging did not pause because he had a chemistry exam the following morning. A building fire did not delay its arrival because he had promised Aunt May he would be home for dinner. The city's need for Spider-Man operated on its own calendar, indifferent to the calendar of Peter Parker's life. And the negotiation between these two sets of demands was something that Peter had to manage not once, or occasionally, but constantly, every day, as a baseline condition of his existence. The mental energy this negotiation consumed was invisible to everyone around him, which meant that no one could account for it when they observed his exhaustion, or his distraction, or his sometimes bewildering inability to be where he had said he would be. Aunt May bore the brunt of the logistical deception in the early years, because she was the person whose proximity to Peter was most constant, and whose attention to him was most careful. She noticed everything, in the way that women who have loved children carefully for many years notice everything. And what she noticed about Peter in the months and years following Ben's death was a pattern of behaviour that she could not reconcile with any explanation she found comfortable. He came home late, sometimes very late, on nights when there was no plausible reason for his absence. He was tired in the mornings with a quality of exhaustion that seemed deeper than ordinary sleeplessness, as though he had been doing something physically demanding rather than simply lying awake with his thoughts. He had bruises occasionally, the kind that appeared on the arms and shoulders and ribs of someone who had been in contact with hard surfaces at speed, which was not what she expected from a boy whose evenings, as far as she knew, were spent studying and taking photographs for the school paper. She asked about the bruises with the particular gentleness she reserved for questions she suspected would not receive honest answers, and Peter gave her the explanations that the situation called for, explanations that were plausible enough to satisfy surface scrutiny without being true, mentions of bumping into furniture in the dark or a stumble on the stairs during an early morning photography expedition. May accepted these explanations in the way that people accept explanations they do not quite believe but choose not to challenge, because the relationship matters more than the accounting, because love sometimes expresses itself as the grace of not pressing when pressing would cause harm. She worried. She always worried. The worry was a constant in her relationship with Peter that predated the spider bite and deepened steadily afterward, and Peter felt it. Felt the specific weight of being worried about by someone you love and cannot reassure with the truth. The physical evidence of Spider-Man's work was perhaps the most immediately difficult aspect of the double life to manage in the domestic context of sharing a home with someone whose attention was both loving and observant. The injuries that Peter sustained during his patrols were real injuries, however much his enhanced healing accelerated their resolution. Cracked ribs from impacts that would have hospitalized an ordinary person healed in days rather than weeks, but they were present in the body for those days, present in the way he held himself, in the careful management of his breathing, in the slight flinching that he could not entirely suppress when May hugged him with her usual warmth and her usual lack of awareness that she was pressing against something that hurt. He learned to manage these physical tells with the same practiced attention he brought to every other aspect of maintaining his secret, adjusting his posture and his movement and the expression on his face with a discipline that was, in its own way, a form of performance. Beyond the injuries were the more mundane but equally demanding physical requirements of being Spider-Man that had to be managed in secret. The web fluid that his shooters required was a chemical compound that Peter synthesized himself, which meant that his room needed to contain the materials and equipment for this synthesis without appearing to contain them, which meant organizing his space with a dual logic, the visible logic of a student's bedroom and the hidden logic of a small private laboratory, the empty cartridges that needed to be refilled, the occasional failure of a mechanical component that required repair, the costume itself with its ongoing need for maintenance and concealment. All of these were items on a daily list of practical tasks that had to be accomplished within the margins of his visible life, in the spaces between homework and dinner and the ordinary social obligations of someone trying to maintain the appearance of an ordinary existence. The costume lived, across the years of Peter's adolescence and young adulthood, in a succession of hiding places whose ingenuity reflected the ongoing pressure of the situation. Beneath the loose floorboard in his bedroom, inside the lining of a bag that he carried everywhere and that May occasionally offered to wash. In a locker at school that he had arranged to keep padlocked on the grounds that he used it for photographic equipment, too delicate to leave unprotected. Each hiding place was a small ongoing act of deception, directed at people who trusted him, and each required maintenance. The constant awareness of who might look where and when. The preemptive management of situations that might lead someone to encounter what they were not meant to find. This vigilance had no off switch. It was simply a permanent feature of his consciousness, a background process running continuously beneath everything else he was thinking and doing and feeling. School, during the years when Peter was still a student, presented its own elaborate set of challenges that the double life imposed. The irregular hours of Spider-Man's work meant irregular sleep, and irregular sleep meant showing up to morning classes in states of exhaustion that his teachers noticed and misinterpreted, attributing to adolescent irresponsibility what was actually the consequence of having spent the previous night preventing things from happening to people who would never know his name. His grades, which had been exceptional before the bite, remained strong because his intelligence was genuine and his commitment to learning was real. But they were no longer the effortless excellence of a student with unlimited time and energy. They were the hard-won achievement of someone who was studying in the margins of a life that had very few margins to spare. The absences were the most visible and most difficult to explain. A spider sense alert during a lunch period required a sudden exit that had to be accounted for afterward. A major criminal incident during school hours required either remaining at school and accepting that Spider-Man would not be there, or leaving in a way that produced another entry in the accumulating ledger of Peter Parker's unexplained disappearances. He developed a repertoire of explanations that he cycled through with enough variation to avoid obvious repetition: stomach complaints, forgotten appointments, family emergencies vague enough to resist follow-up questions, the whole apparatus of a fictional supporting life, constructed to explain the gaps in the visible one. His teachers regarded him with the particular mixture of affection and frustration that genuinely talented but apparently undependable students generate in the people responsible for their education, and Peter bore this misreading of his character with the patience of someone who understands that the truth would be even more difficult to explain than the mystery. The financial dimension of this concealed life added a layer of practical stress that ran beneath everything else, with a low, constant pressure. The materials for web fluid cost money. Replacement components for the shooters cost money. The costume, which sustained damage in the course of regular use and required periodic reconstruction, cost money. None of these costs could be explained to Aunt May or claimed on any kind of expense account. They came out of whatever Peter could earn, which in the early years was not very much, and they competed with the real and pressing costs of the household, the groceries and the utilities, and the medical expenses that were a recurring feature of May's life, creating a financial arithmetic that was chronically difficult to balance. The solution that Peter found, selling photographs of Spider-Man to the Daily Bugle, was ingenious in its way, and deeply strange in another way, a strangeness that he lived with so constantly that it became simply part of the texture of his life rather than the remarkable paradox it actually was. He was, through the mechanism of his camera and his carefully pre-positioned shots, and his intimate knowledge of exactly where Spider-Man would be and what he would be doing, profiting from his own heroic activities, turning his secret into an income stream that kept the secret viable. The arrangement required him to photograph himself, which required him to set up cameras before confrontations began, to think about framing and light and angle, while simultaneously thinking about the tactical challenges of whatever criminal situation he was about to engage with, to maintain, in other words, a kind of professional detachment from his own most intense experiences, observing them even as he lived them. Jonah Jameson paid fairly for good photographs, which was perhaps the only uncomplicated element of the arrangement, and Peter needed the money. Which was also uncomplicated. Everything else about the situation was layered with an irony so consistent that it stopped feeling like irony and started feeling like simply the way things were. The man who bought the photographs was the same man whose editorial pages called Spider-Man a menace and a fraud, and a dangerous influence on impressionable young people. The money that Peter used to keep his aunt's household running and his web shooters functional came directly from the public defamation of his alter ego. He sat in Jameson's office and accepted payment for images of himself, and listened to Jameson's pronouncements about the wall crawler's essential untrustworthiness, and said nothing, because saying nothing was the only option available, and because there was something in the absurdity of the situation that he had learned over time to regard with something approaching dark affection. This was his life. This was what his life looked like from the inside, what the double life produced, beyond its practical demands and its financial complications, and its ongoing requirement for managed deception, was a particular quality of loneliness that distinguished itself from ordinary loneliness by being located not in the absence of connection but in the presence of it. Peter was not alone. He was surrounded, through most of his life, by people who loved him and wanted his company, and sought out his presence with genuine warmth. Aunt May at the kitchen table, friends at school and later at university, colleagues at the Bugle, romantic partners whose care for him was real, and whose desire to know him was real, and whose knowledge of him was, for reasons he could never explain to them, permanently and fundamentally incomplete. This incompleteness was the most intimate cost of the secret. Not the bruises or the missed dinners or the creative scheduling or the financial strain, though all of these were real, and all of them accumulated across years into something heavy. The deepest cost was the experience of being known partially, of offering the portion of yourself that is available for offering and holding back the portion that defines you most completely, of having the conversations you can have instead of the conversations you need to have, and of doing this not occasionally or in moments of particular difficulty but as the baseline condition of every relationship in your life. Peter Parker was, in the rooms he occupied, and the conversations he participated in, and the eyes that looked at him with love and concern and curiosity, a performance of himself. Not a dishonest performance, because the person being performed was real, the intelligence and the humour and the kindness and the moral seriousness were genuinely his. But a performance nonetheless, shaped by the permanent awareness of what could not be said. He carried this awareness into every room he entered. He carried it into classrooms and newsrooms and hospital waiting areas and quiet evenings at home with May, and he carried it with such consistency and for such a sustained period of years that it became, like all things carried for long enough, simply part of the posture of his life. Something he no longer consciously noticed because noticing it had become indistinguishable from simply being himself. This was perhaps the subtlest and most complete victory of the double life over the interior freedom of the person living it. Not that it made him unhappy, because it did not always make him unhappy, but that it made the alternative, the life of someone known fully and loved in the fullness of being known, genuinely difficult to imagine. Peter Parker had been performing his own partial version for so long that the performance had become, in the most practical sense, who he was. The man beneath the performance was Spider-Man, and Spider-Man went home every night to a house where nobody knew his name. There was one person in Peter Parker's world who spoke about Spider-Man constantly, loudly, and with a conviction that never wavered across decades of evidence to the contrary. And that person was not an ally or a supporter, or someone whose opinion was shaped by anything as flexible as facts. J. Jonah Jameson, publisher of the Daily Bugle, possessor of one of the most recognizable moustaches in New York journalism, and architect of the most sustained single-person campaign of public defamation in the history of the city's media landscape, had decided in the earliest days of Spider-Man's career that the wall-crawler was a menace, and he had spent the years that followed investing that decision with the full force of his considerable professional resources, his editorial platform, his instinct for the inflammatory headline, and his absolute refusal to allow inconvenient evidence to complicate a narrative he had already determined to be true. He was wrong about Spider-Man in almost every particular. He was also, in ways that the simple accounting of his wrongness does not capture, a genuinely complex human being whose hostility toward the masked hero made a kind of psychological sense that deserves to be understood rather than simply dismissed. Jameson had built the Daily Bugle from a mid-tier tabloid into one of the most widely read newspapers in New York through a combination of genuine journalistic instinct, relentless work ethic, and an editorial philosophy that placed the exposure of corruption and hypocrisy at the center of the paper's mission. He believed in accountability. He believed that power, wherever it resided and whatever form it took, needed to be subject to scrutiny and answerable to the public it affected. These were not cynical beliefs held for strategic purposes. They were convictions that had shaped his entire professional life, that he had acted on at personal cost on more than one occasion, and that represented the best version of what he understood journalism to be for. When he looked at Spider-Man, a figure of enormous power who operated behind a mask and answered to no authority, and could not be questioned or investigated or held responsible through any of the mechanisms that a democratic society had developed for managing the powerful, he saw something that his deepest professional instincts told him was dangerous. He was applying, in other words, a principled framework to a situation that the framework did not quite fit, and arriving at conclusions that were wrong in their specifics while being coherent in their logic. This is worth holding for a moment, because the easiest version of Jonah Jameson is the version in which he is simply a blowhard and a bully, a man whose ego and stubbornness produce cruelty without consequence. And while there is truth in this version, it is not the complete version. and the complete version is more interesting and more useful for understanding what his campaign against Spider-Man actually cost Peter Parker across the years of their strange and asymmetrical relationship. Jameson was not stupid. He was not without principle. He was a man whose principles had calcified around an initial judgment in a way that made revision feel like defeat, and who had the platform and the stubbornness to ensure that his unrevised judgment reached the largest possible audience on a daily basis. His son, John Jameson, was the other significant element in the psychological portrait, the detail that transforms Jonah from a type into a person. John was an astronaut, a genuine hero in the institutional sense, a man who had risked his life in the service of scientific exploration and whose bravery had been certified by the government and celebrated by the press and validated by every authority that Jonah's worldview recognized as legitimate. John Jameson was a hero with a name and a face and a record and a chain of command, accountable to the organizations that trained him and answerable to the public through the normal mechanisms of democratic oversight. He represented, in his father's understanding, what heroism was supposed to look like. And then there was Spider-Man, anonymous and unaccountable, swinging through the city that John Jameson also served, receiving the kind of spontaneous public adoration that his son's more institutional heroism never quite generated, celebrated in the streets by people who did not know his name and could not know his motives and had simply decided, on the basis of spectacle and rumour, that he deserved their admiration. The competitive jealousy that Jonah felt on his son's behalf was not something he would have acknowledged, or perhaps even consciously recognised, but it shaped his response to Spider-Man from the very beginning, adding a personal charge to what he might otherwise have framed purely as principled journalistic skepticism. Every editorial he wrote calling Spider-Man a showboater seeking personal glory carried within it, beneath the professional language of public accountability, the unspoken question of why this masked nobody received the city's affection, when his son, a genuinely accomplished man who had earned his recognition through legitimate means, was celebrated more quietly and more conventionally. The irrationality of the campaign, its persistence in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence, its tendency to escalate rather than moderate as Spider-Man's heroic record accumulated, makes more sense when this personal dimension is understood as a contributing factor. For Peter, the existence of Jameson's campaign was a feature of his life so constant that it became, like his financial anxiety and his managed exhaustion, simply part of the landscape rather than an event. He read the editorials. He could not avoid reading them, since the paper that published them was also the paper that paid his rent, and since the photographs he sold to that paper sometimes appeared on the same page as the editorial content calling his alter ego a public menace. This juxtaposition, which would have struck an outside observer as almost surreally absurd, was for Peter simply Tuesday. He sat in the Bugle offices and listened to Jameson hold forth on Spider-Man's essential untrustworthiness, and nodded at the appropriate moments and accepted his payment and went home and put the money toward whatever was most urgently needed that week. What the campaign cost him was not primarily the practical inconvenience of working for a man who despised his alter ego, though that inconvenience was real and recurring. What it cost him was more intimate than that, more connected to the interior life that he was already managing with such care and at such ongoing expense. The daily public narrative that Jameson constructed and distributed to the city's readership was a narrative about who Spider-Man was, about his motives and his character and his fitness to occupy the role he had assumed, and it was a narrative that was wrong in almost every particular, constructed from the outside by someone who had never spoken to Spider-Man, never attempted to understand his origins or his commitments, and had no interest in the possibility that his initial assessment might have been mistaken. Peter could not correct this narrative. He could not write a letter to the editor explaining that the wall-crawler's motives were genuine and his sacrifices were real, and that the man behind the mask was someone whose commitment to the city's safety had cost him more than Jameson would ever know. He could only absorb the narrative and carry it alongside everything else he was already carrying. The psychological literature on the experience of being publicly misrepresented without the ability to respond is not something that Peter had occasion to consult, but the experience itself was one he understood from the inside with the thoroughness of someone who had lived it for years. There is a particular quality of helplessness in knowing that a large number of people believe something false about you, and being unable, for reasons that cannot be explained, to offer the truth. It is different from the helplessness of being unable to change a circumstance, because circumstances can sometimes be changed by indirect means. The helplessness of a misrepresented identity is more complete, because the very thing that would resolve it, the truth, is the thing that cannot be offered. Peter absorbed Jameson's editorials and the public sentiment they generated, and the way that sentiment occasionally made his work as Spider-Man harder and more dangerous. When police officers responded to the wall crawler with hostility rather than cooperation, when bystanders who might have helped chose instead to record the spectacle for the same tabloid that had told them he was a menace, and he absorbed all of this without the relief of being able to say to anyone that it hurt, because it did hurt. This is perhaps the aspect of Jameson's campaign that the simplest telling of the story tends to minimize, the way that years of sustained public contempt directed at an identity you inhabit genuinely and with full moral seriousness produces damage in the person being contempted. Peter's public self-presentation as Spider-Man included the wisecracking humour and the apparently breezy indifference to criticism that had become part of the character's public face, and this presentation served genuine purposes, keeping confrontations from becoming grimly earnest, using levity to manage tension in situations that required quick thinking rather than brooding, projecting a kind of confidence that was partly genuine and partly constructed. But beneath the performance, the criticism landed. The doubt that Jameson consistently worked to cultivate in the public about Spider-Man's character and motives found some purchase in Peter's own interior, because Peter was already, by nature and by the particular formation of his conscience, someone who scrutinized his own motivations with a rigor that did not require external prompting. He had, after all, chosen selfishness once, and paid for it with the most important loss of his life. The possibility that he might be choosing wrongly again, that his commitment to secrecy was a form of self-protection rather than genuine necessity, that his insistence on operating outside institutional oversight was a preference rather than a principled position, that some portion of Jameson's critique might be correct in ways he was unwilling to acknowledge. These doubts visited him with a regularity that Jameson's editorials did nothing to reduce and something to amplify. The publisher would never know that his campaign found its most attentive reader in the subject of its contempt, or that the Spider-Man who read each new denunciation did so with the particular attention of someone checking their own moral arithmetic against an external accounting that they suspected was wrong but could not entirely dismiss. The city itself occupied a complicated middle position in its relationship with the wall crawler that Jameson's campaign both reflected and helped to create. New York was not monolithic in its opinion of Spider-Man, never had been, and the variance in how ordinary people understood and responded to his presence in their lives tracked fairly closely with the variance in their own experiences of power and authority and the institutions designed to mediate between them. People who had reason to distrust official channels, who had found that the police did not always come or did not always help when they came, who lived in neighborhoods where institutional protection was intermittent and unreliable, tended to regard Spider-Man with a warmth that was uncomplicated by the questions Jameson raised about accountability and oversight. For these people, the wall crawler was simply someone who showed up and helped. And the showing up and helping was sufficient. The questions about his identity and his legitimacy were questions for people who had the luxury of being protected by the institutions whose authority those questions were designed to uphold. Others brought more institutional faith and more institutional anxiety to their assessment, and for these people, Jameson's questions carried genuine weight. An anonymous figure with the power to affect the outcomes of situations involving life and death, operating without oversight, without accountability, without any mechanism by which the public could evaluate his judgment or correct his errors. This was, from a certain perspective, exactly the kind of power that democratic societies had developed their frameworks of accountability specifically to prevent. The fact that Spider-Man appeared to use this power well did not resolve the structural concern, because the structural concern was precisely that there was no guarantee of continued good use, no check on the possibility of future misuse, nothing between the city and the wall crawler's judgment except the wall crawler's judgment. Peter understood this argument. He had thought through it himself, more carefully and with more genuine engagement than most of the people who made it publicly. The decision to maintain his secret identity and to operate outside institutional channels was not one he'd made carelessly, or without recognizing its costs, and the costs included this one, the legitimate democratic concern about unaccountable power, which he had weighed against the costs of revelation, and arrived, repeatedly, and with full awareness of the difficulty, at the conclusion that the secret was necessary. He could not explain this reasoning to Jameson, or to the portion of the public that shared Jameson's concerns. He could only act as consistently and as carefully as he could in ways that accumulated a record against which the theoretical concern about his accountability might eventually be weighed. The Daily Bugle office itself became one of the stranger domestic spaces in Peter's life across the years of his association with it, a place where he was known in one identity and discussed in another, where the same person managed two entirely separate relationships with the same institutional context. As Peter Parker, he was a freelance photographer of genuine if inconsistent talent, someone the editorial staff regarded with a mixture of affection and mild exasperation, a young man who clearly had ability but whose reliability left something to be desired. Betty Brandt, who managed Jonah's schedule and the front office with an efficiency that made the entire operation function, was warm toward Peter in a way that made the office feel less hostile than it might otherwise have been. Robbie Robertson, the editor whose judgment and decency provided a consistent moral counterweight to Jameson's excesses, treated Peter with a respect that extended beyond the transactional basis of their professional relationship. These relationships were real, and they mattered to Peter, and they existed entirely within the Daily Bugle's understanding of him as a photographer who happened to be very good at getting pictures of Spider-Man. The other relationship, the one between the Bugle and Spider-Man, was conducted through Jameson's editorials and the paper's ongoing coverage of the wall-crawler's activities, and it was a relationship of pure hostility dressed in the language of principled journalism. Peter navigated between these two modes every time he walked through the Bugle's doors, shifting from the young photographer who collected his check and made small talk with Betty, to the invisible subject of the editorial campaign being conducted in the office around him, and this navigation, practiced until it became second nature, was another iteration of the same essential performance that structured his entire life. What Jonah Jameson never understood, and perhaps could not have understood without the information that would have rewritten his entire understanding of the situation, was that the masked figure he had spent so many years publicly despising was someone who agreed with him about several of the most important things. Peter Parker believed in accountability. He believed that power required justification, and that people who affected the lives of others without their consent carried an obligation to those people that could not be dissolved by good intentions alone. He believed these things as deeply and as consistently as Jameson did, and he acted on them in the only way available to him, through the daily practice of showing up and helping and accepting the costs and carrying the losses, and continuing day after day in the face of a public narrative that called his character into question to be exactly the hero that the narrative insisted he was not. The irony of this situation, the deep and structural irony of a man being publicly condemned for the values he most completely embodied, was one that Peter bore in silence, because silence was, as it so often was, the only honest option available to him. If the Daily Bugle represented the public face of Peter Parker's impossible position, the place where the tension between his two identities played out in the impersonal register of institutional life, then his romantic relationships represented the place where that same tension became most intimate, most painful, and most impossible to resolve through any of the practical strategies he had developed for managing everything else. A man can learn to hide bruises. He can learn to construct convincing explanations for his absences, and to manage the financial complications of a secret life, and to read his employer's editorials about his own alter ego without visible reaction. What he cannot do, not without a cost that accumulates with compound interest across every year it is paid, is love someone fully while withholding from them the most essential truth about who he is. Peter Parker attempted this, with every woman he ever cared about, and the attempt produced a recurring pattern of connection and concealment, and eventual fracture that shaped the emotional landscape of his adult life as profoundly as any villain he ever faced. It is important to approach this pattern with the generosity it deserves, because the easiest interpretation that Peter's failures in love were the product of immaturity or emotional unavailability or some fundamental incapacity for genuine intimacy misses the actual nature of what was happening and therefore misses what it cost him. Peter Parker was not someone who was afraid of love or unwilling to commit to it. He was someone who loved deeply and consistently and with a quality of attention that the people he loved recognized and valued. The problem was never the love. The problem was always the secret, the gap between what he felt and what he could say, between who he was and who he was permitted to be, in the context of a relationship with someone whose safety depended, as he understood it, on their not knowing the truth. He was not protecting himself by keeping the secret. He was, or so he believed, protecting them. This belief was genuine, and it was not entirely wrong, and it produced across the years some of the deepest loneliness of his life. Betty Brant was the first person Peter genuinely loved in the adult sense of love that involves sustained attention and real emotional investment and the kind of hope that is distinct from mere attraction. She was older than him by a few years, possessed of a maturity that came from having taken care of herself and the people around her from a relatively young age, and she treated him with a respect and a warmth that were, in the context of Peter's social life at the time, genuinely unusual. Most people his age related to him through the lens of the school's social hierarchy, in which he occupied a position that made serious engagement with him optional at best. Betty did not have access to that hierarchy, and therefore did not apply it, and what she found when she encountered Peter Parker without its filters was someone worth knowing, someone whose intelligence and sincerity and fundamental decency were visible to anyone who looked at him without the distorting influence of whatever category his peers had assigned him to. Their relationship developed in the margins of the Daily Bugle's daily operations, in the small exchanges that accumulated over weeks and months into something that both of them recognized, gradually and with some mutual uncertainty, as more than professional courtesy. Peter found in Betty someone he could almost be honest with, which was a more valuable thing than it might sound, given how little almost honesty was available to him in most of his relationships. He could not tell her about Spider-Man, could not explain his absences or his injuries, or the particular quality of distraction that came over him when his spider sense registered something happening nearby that Spider-Man needed to address. But he could talk to her about responsibility and about the difficulty of doing the right thing in complicated circumstances. And she listened to these conversations with the attentiveness of someone who recognized in them a genuine moral seriousness that she found compelling. What ended the possibility of what they might have built together was not Peter's secret alone, though the secret was present in the ending as it was present in everything. Betty's brother Bennett had fallen into debt with criminals whose methods of collection were not limited to conventional financial pressure, and the entanglement of Spider-Man's activities with the situation that resulted produced consequences that touched Betty's life in ways she could not entirely process. The specific grief and confusion that came from this, combined with the ongoing mystery of Peter's disappearances and the limitations that his secret placed on the comfort he could offer her, created a distance that neither of them had the information to close. They parted without resolution, which is how many things in Peter's life concluded, in the unfinished key of circumstances that could not be explained. Gwen Stacy arrived in Peter's life at Empire State University with the quality of someone who had always been meant to be there, which is to say that she arrived quietly and gradually, and revealed her importance not through dramatic entrance, but through the slow accumulation of moments in which her presence made everything slightly clearer and slightly warmer. She was the daughter of Captain George Stacy, a police captain whose integrity and intelligence Peter would come to respect deeply, and she had inherited from her father a quality of clear-eyed moral attention that expressed itself not as judgment, but as genuine interest in understanding people and situations as they actually were, rather than as they appeared. She was beautiful in a way that was inseparable from her intelligence, and intelligent in a way that made her beauty feel like an expression of character, rather than a separate feature. And she was, from relatively early in her relationship with Peter, clearly capable of loving him with a depth and a consistency that he recognized as something rare. The specific tragedy of Peter's relationship with Gwen was not that they were wrong for each other. They were not wrong for each other. It was that the secret stood between them at exactly the moments when its absence would have allowed something genuinely complete to develop, creating in its place a relationship that was deeply loving and permanently partial, sustained by real feeling on both sides and limited by the information that one side could not provide. Gwen knew that something was being withheld. She was too perceptive not to know this. The question of what it was, and why Peter could not or would not offer it, became a source of quiet, ongoing uncertainty in their relationship, a slight fog at the edges of what was otherwise clear and warm, and this uncertainty shaped Gwen's experience of loving him in ways that she could not fully articulate because she did not have the vocabulary for the specific situation she was in. She had lost her father, Captain Stacy, in the way described elsewhere in this story, and in the particular grief and anger of that loss she had turned, with understandable but devastating inaccuracy, towards Spider-Man as a figure on whom some portion of her pain could be placed. Peter had held her while she grieved for a man who had known Peter's secret and kept it, who had died in the service of the same mission that Peter served, and he had been unable to tell her any of this, unable to offer the context that might have changed the quality of her grief if not its depth, unable to be fully present to her in the way that the moment demanded because the moment demanded a truth he was not free to give. He had loved her through her anger at his alter ego and maintained his silence, and watched the distance between them grow from something bridgeable into something else. And then she'd gone to London, and time had passed, and the distance had become structural. When Gwen returned, something had shifted in her understanding, the way that distance sometimes allows a person to see what proximity had obscured. And the anger towards Spider-Man had softened into something more complicated and more generous. The love between her and Peter reasserted itself with the renewed energy of something that had survived a genuine test, and there was a period, too brief and too precious, when it seemed possible that what they had might grow into something that could sustain both of them for the rest of their lives. Peter felt this possibility, and wanted it with a completeness that he recognized as different from anything he had wanted before. A wanting that came from the deepest part of his sense of himself and his future. The George Washington Bridge ended that possibility, and the ending has been examined elsewhere in this account with the fullness it deserves. What belongs here, in the examination of what the secret cost Peter in the domain of love, is the specific grief of losing someone he had loved imperfectly. At a distance enforced by the very thing he did in order to protect her. The protection had failed in the most total way available to it, and the love that had been constrained by the secret was now constrained by something more final, and the secret remained, kept now on behalf of no one, serving nothing except the protection of a truth that the person it had been meant to protect would never now know. Mary Jane Watson had been present in Peter's life for much of the period during which these other relationships developed and concluded, a figure at the periphery of his social world, Aunt May's enthusiastic recommendation, his friends' occasional invitations, a name that preceded her actual arrival in his life by what seemed like years. When she finally appeared, her famous opening line carrying the particular energy of someone who has assessed a situation completely and found it amusing, she was everything Peter had not expected and could not quite categorize, which was in itself a form of introduction to what she would eventually become to him. The early version of Mary Jane that Peter knew, the party girl, the social creature who moved through every room as though it had been arranged for her arrival, the person who treated emotional depth as something to be avoided in favor of surface pleasures and immediate satisfactions, was not a false version of her. It was a real version, a version she had constructed for real reasons out of real material, and it served real purposes in her life. She had grown up in circumstances that made emotional investment feel dangerous, in a family where love was inconsistently available and disappointment was reliably delivered, and she had learned, with the adaptive intelligence of someone who survives difficult childhoods by developing protective strategies, that the best way to avoid being hurt was to avoid being known. If no one knew where you actually lived, emotionally speaking, no one could find their way to the thing that mattered and damage it. What this meant for Peter, in the early years of knowing her, was that she was wonderful company and an essentially unavailable intimate partner, present and charming and genuinely warm in the ways that did not require her to be vulnerable, and absent in the ways that did. He liked her enormously, and found her energy a genuine relief from the weight that his interior life was always generating, and he did not, for a long time, expect more from her than she was offering, because what she was offering was already more uncomplicated pleasure than he received from most other sources. The transformation in what Mary Jane offered, and what she required of herself in order to offer it, did not happen through a single moment of revelation, but through the accumulated pressure of crisis and proximity, and the gradual discovery that she was capable of things she had not previously tested in herself. When Peter's grief became impossible to manage alone, when the losses accumulated to a point where the performance of ordinary functioning required more than he had available, Mary Jane was there in a way that surprised both of them. She did not retreat from the weight of his pain into the safer territory of lightness and distraction. She moved toward it, with the instinctive accuracy of someone who recognizes that this is the moment when presence matters more than comfort, and she provided a kind of companionship that asked nothing of him, except that he continue to exist, which was, at certain points, exactly the right amount to ask. What this cost her was the armor she'd spent years constructing. To be genuinely present to Peter's grief required her to be genuinely present in a way that her protective strategies had been specifically designed to prevent. And choosing to do it anyway was an act of courage that he recognized and valued even when he was too consumed by his own pain to articulate his recognition. She became, through this process of choosing to be known in the act of truly knowing someone else, a different and more complete version of herself, and the relationship that developed from this mutual transformation was built on foundations that neither of her earlier relational strategies, his sustained concealment, or her practiced unavailability could have produced. The eventual revelation of Peter's secret to Mary Jane, which came through her own perception rather than his disclosure, changed the nature of their relationship in ways that were simultaneously liberating and newly complicated. She knew who he was and what he did and what it cost him, and why the absences and the injuries and the careful management of information had been necessary, and she had chosen, with full knowledge of what the choice entailed, to stay. This choosing, freely made with complete information, was something Peter had never received from anyone he loved, and its value to him was incalculable in the truest sense of that word, beyond the reach of any calculation he knew how to perform. But knowing the secret did not dissolve the problems the secret had always generated. It transformed them into new configurations of the same essential difficulty. Now Mary Jane carried the knowledge and its weight, lived inside the anxiety that Peter had always lived inside alone, faced the daily reality of loving someone who left in the night to do dangerous things and might not come back. The sharing of the burden was genuine and genuinely valuable. It was also, she discovered, a different kind of burden than the one she had imagined when she had imagined it from outside. Peter loved Mary Jane with the full knowledge of her, with the specific affection that comes from being seen in your actual complexity and chosen anyway. And this was a quality of love that he had not previously experienced, that was different in its texture from what he had felt for Betty or Gwen, not greater or lesser, but differently sourced, coming from a place of mutual recognition rather than the bittersweet partial knowing that his secret had imposed on every previous relationship. He had spent years loving people who loved a version of him, and now he was loved by someone who loved the whole of him. The photographer and the hero and the grieving boy from Queens, and the man he had become through decades of carrying more than any person should be asked to carry alone. What the full arc of his romantic life revealed, taken together and regarded with the honesty it deserves, was not a story of failure but a story of the particular cost of a particular kind of integrity. Peter had kept his secret because he believed, genuinely and with good reason, that keeping it protected the people he loved. The secret had also, by the same mechanism, prevented those people from fully knowing the person they loved, which meant that some portion of what they lost when they lost him, or what they failed to receive when they were with him, was the complete version of a man who was, in his completeness, worth knowing. The secret had cost him, and it had cost them. And the cost was real and ongoing and not fully resolvable. This is not a tragedy in the sense of a story that ends badly. It is a tragedy in the older sense, the sense in which a person of genuine worth is subject to a limitation that their worth cannot overcome, and in which the limitation and the worth are, in some deep way, expressions of the same thing. There are moments in a life that function as dividing lines, events so complete in their rupture of what came before that everything afterward is understood in relation to them, dated from them, measured against the standard they establish for what loss actually means, and what it costs, and what it asks of the person who survives it. Peter Parker had already lived through one such moment by the time he reached his young adulthood. The night in the warehouse in Queens when the recognition of a criminal's face had rewritten his understanding of his own responsibility and his own failure in terms that would never be fully revised. He carried that night with him always, as has been described, as both wound and compass, as the thing that hurt and the thing that oriented. What happened on the George Washington Bridge arrived as a second dividing line of this kind, different in its nature from the first but equal in its permanence, and the life that Peter Parker lived after it was shaped by it in ways that reached into every corner of his existence and rearranged what they found there. To understand what the bridge meant, it is necessary to understand who Gwen Stacy was in the full sense of who she had become by the time that night arrived. Not just in relation to Peter, but in herself, as a person who had developed through the years of their relationship into someone whose presence in the world was genuinely valuable, and whose absence from it would constitute a real diminishment of what the world contained. The Gwen Stacy who had returned from London was not the same person who had left. She had gone away in grief and anger, carrying the weight of her father's death and the misplaced portion of her grief that had attached itself to Spider-Man as a convenient object for feelings that needed somewhere to go. She had spent her time abroad doing the difficult interior work of mourning properly, of allowing the full weight of her father's absence to settle into her without the distorting pressure of anger to hold it at a manageable distance. And she had come back with a clarity about her own feelings and a generosity toward the complexities of other people's lives that the woman who had left did not quite possess. Captain George Stacy had known Peter's secret. This has been established, and its importance cannot be overstated in the context of understanding what Gwen's death meant to Peter, because it meant that the man who had died in the Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus confrontation, the man whose death had generated Gwen's initial anger toward the wall-crawler, had died with a full understanding of who Spider-Man was and what he stood for and why the work mattered. His final words, asking Peter to take care of Gwen, had been addressed to the complete person, to Spider-Man and Peter Parker simultaneously, and they had carried the weight of someone who had assessed the situation in its full complexity and arrived at a judgment that was generous and clear-eyed and entirely without resentment. Captain Stacy had understood. He had chosen in his final moments to use his understanding in service of the people he loved, rather than in service of any other possible response to the situation. Gwen had arrived at something approaching this understanding herself, through her own route and in her own time, and the love that she brought back to Peter from London carried within it the fullness of this arrival. She was not simply offering him her affection, which she had always offered. She was offering him her trust, her renewed and deliberate trust, extended with full awareness of the complications and the mysteries that had always existed in their relationship, and that she had chosen, finally, to accept as part of the texture of loving him, rather than as obstacles to it. Peter received this trust with a gratitude that he could not fully express, that existed at a depth beneath the available language, and he allowed himself, perhaps for the first time in his relationship with her, to hope in a way that felt genuinely sustainable, genuinely pointed toward a future, rather than provisional and contingent on circumstances he could not control. This hope, specific and warm and located in the ordinary details of the life they were beginning to build together, was what Norman Osborn targeted when he chose Gwen Stacy as the instrument of Spider-Man's destruction. Norman's psychology has been examined elsewhere, the returning memories, the restored Green Goblin persona, the particular transformation of professional ambition into personal obsession that the Goblin formula both created and amplified. What belongs here is the precision of his choice, the specific intelligence that identified Gwen not as the most vulnerable person in Peter's life, but as the most essential one, the person whose presence made the future feel real, and whose loss would therefore do something that mere physical defeat never could, which was to destroy Peter's ability to believe that the future was worth protecting. The night itself arrived without warning of the particular kind that would have been useful, which is to say that Peter's spider sense, that remarkable biological adaptation that had saved him from countless physical dangers across the years of his career, was not calibrated to detect the approach of the worst thing that would ever happen to him. Spider sense responded to physical threat, to the concrete and immediate danger of bodies in motion and weapons aimed and structural failures imminent. It did not respond to the Green Goblin's awareness, gathering in the shadows of the city's evening, of where Gwen Stacy was and how accessible she was, and how completely her absence would unmake the man who loved her. The bridge. It is difficult, even in the gentlest telling, to approach the bridge without feeling the specific gravity of what happened there. The way that certain places become permanently altered by the events that occurred in them become more than geography. Become instead the physical location of something that changed the moral landscape of a life. The George Washington Bridge, suspended above the dark water of the Hudson, with the lights of the city spread on both sides and the wind moving through its cables, became that kind of place on that particular night, and it has remained that kind of place in the architecture of Peter Parker's memory ever since. Norman arrived as the Green Goblin in the full theatrical expression of that identity, on his glider, with Gwen unconscious in his hold, having arranged the confrontation with the deliberateness of someone who's been planning it for long enough to consider every detail. The choice of the bridge was not accidental. Height was part of the calculation, the specific tactical advantage of a location where the consequences of failure were absolute, and where the hero's commitment to protecting innocent life could be weaponized against him with particular efficiency. Norman understood, as he always understood in the Green Goblin configuration, that Spider-Man's greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability were the same thing, that his willingness to sacrifice himself for others could be turned into the mechanism of his own destruction if the geometry of the situation was arranged correctly. Peter arrived with the full weight of his love for Gwen shaping every response he made, which was precisely what Norman had intended and precisely what made the situation so dangerous. The tactical clarity that had served Spider-Man in hundreds of confrontations, the ability to read a situation quickly and identify the best available response and execute it with the physical gifts the spider bite had given him, was compromised from the first moment of the encounter by the emotional reality of seeing the person he loved in mortal danger. This was not a weakness in any meaningful sense. It was simply the truth of love, that it reaches into the body and alters the way the body responds to the world, and that no amount of training or discipline or accumulated heroic experience fully insulates a person from this alteration when the stakes are sufficiently personal. Norman taunted, as he always taunted, with the particular cruelty of someone who understands that words directed at the right wound do more damage than any physical weapon. He knew Peter's secret. He had known it for years, had used it as leverage before, and now he used it again in the most extreme form available, addressing Spider-Man as Peter, identifying the specific texture of what Peter stood to lose, describing in explicit terms what he intended to do with Gwen and why the doing of it would constitute a more complete victory than any previous confrontation between them had produced. The words were designed to destabilize, to force emotional responses that would interfere with tactical judgment, and they succeeded in this design because they were aimed with the accuracy of someone who had studied his target with the thoroughness that genuine obsession provides. The physical battle that took place on and around the bridge's structure was unlike previous confrontations between them in the way that all confrontations are unlike their predecessors when the stakes have been elevated beyond their previous register. Peter fought with a ferocity that went beyond his usual measured application of force, pressing the engagement with an intensity that reflected both his genuine fear for Gwen's safety and the rage that Norman's words had generated in him, and the Green Goblin met this intensity with the calculating patience of someone who had positioned himself advantageously and was content to allow the hero's emotional investment to become the primary factor in the outcome. The moment when Norman released Gwen from the bridge came suddenly, as it was designed to come, in the space between one breath and the next, without transition or preparation, or any of the signals that Peter's spider sense might have processed as warning. One moment she was a captive, the next she was falling. The distance between these two states was so brief and so absolute that the mind struggles to contain them as sequential rather than simultaneous, and Peter's response was immediate and complete, and driven by the deepest instinct available to him, which was the instinct to catch what was falling, to place himself and his abilities between the person he loved and the thing that threatened her, to do the one thing that Spider-Man was most essentially equipped to do. The web line left his shooter and crossed the distance and found her, and the physics of the moment assembled themselves around the act of catching, in the way that physics always assembles itself, without regard for the emotional weight of the situation or the purity of the intention that produced it. Gwen had been falling long enough, and at sufficient velocity that the sudden arrest of her fall, the abrupt transition from acceleration to deceleration that the web line imposed on her body, produced a consequence that the hero who caught her could not have prevented and cannot be held responsible for in any meaningful moral sense, but that he would hold himself responsible for in every other sense for the rest of his life. The sound that accompanied the catch, a sound that has been described and interpreted and argued about in every retelling of this story, was the sound of physics operating without mercy, of forces in collision, of the limitation of even extraordinary ability in the face of the specific arithmetic of bodies falling from great heights. She was gone, the woman who had come back from London with her trust restored, and her love offered in its fullness, who had known Peter as well as the secret permitted anyone to know him, and had chosen him in the fullness of that knowing, who had her father's capacity for clear-eyed generosity, and her own particular warmth and intelligence, and everything that made her irreplaceable in the specific way that every individual person is irreplaceable, was gone. The webline had done what weblines do, and the thing it had been sent to prevent had happened anyway, and there was no revision available, no additional heroic effort that the situation could accommodate, no version of what came next in which Gwen Stacy was alive. What happened to Peter in the moments that followed exists in a register that is genuinely difficult to describe with the precision that it deserves, because what happened was not a single identifiable response, but a confluence of things that arrived simultaneously and occupied the same interior space without resolving into any coherent emotional state. The grief was immediate and total, the kind of grief that arrives before it can be understood or contextualized or metabolized in any way, that exists first as pure physical sensation in the chest and the throat and the hands, that precedes any cognitive processing of what has been lost and why the loss is as large as it is. Alongside the grief was the rage, which had been present since the confrontation began, but which now achieved a clarity and an intensity that it had not previously possessed, directed entirely and without remainder at the man on the glider above him who had made this happen, who had chosen this outcome and engineered it with the deliberateness of someone acting from hatred rather than desperation. And beneath both of these, beneath the grief and the rage and the terrible clarity of the immediate situation, was something quieter and more devastating. A recognition that arrived in the same register as his understanding in the warehouse years before, the understanding that something he had done, an act motivated entirely by love and executed with the full application of his abilities, had contributed to the worst outcome available. He had caught her. He had done what Spider-Man does. And the catching had not been enough, and the not being enough had a specific quality this time that was different from the many previous times his best efforts had fallen short, because this time the person it had not been enough for was the person whose loss was most incompatible with the continuation of ordinary life. Norman celebrated. This detail belongs in the telling because it is essential to understanding what happened next, what Peter came closest to becoming in the minutes that followed Gwen's death, and why the fact that he did not become it represents one of the most significant moral achievements of his entire career. Norman Osborn, in the full expression of the Green Goblin persona, looked at what he had done and found it good, found it sufficient, found it a cause for the particular exultation that the most complete expressions of cruelty produce in people who have abandoned their humanity, completely enough to feel exultation rather than horror at such a sight. He had wanted to destroy Spider-Man, and he believed, in those moments, that he had. What Peter did next was fight. He fought with everything he had, with the grief and the rage combined into something that had no name and no precedent in his previous experience, with a ferocity that went beyond the measured application of force that had always characterized his approach to combat and entered a register that frightened him even as he inhabited it, because he recognized in it the presence of something he had never allowed to express itself before, the full unrestricted desire to hurt the person in front of him as completely and as permanently as possible. Norman had hurt him beyond any previous experience of being hurt, and Spider-Man, in those minutes on the bridge, was very close to responding in kind. The line that he did not cross, the decision that preserved his identity as a hero in the moment when everything that had made heroism meaningful to him had just been destroyed, was not made easily or cleanly, or from a position of moral certainty. It was made in the midst of the worst pain he had ever experienced, in the presence of the woman he loved lying still at the end of a web line. With his hands already having made contact with Norman Osborn in ways that were doing genuine damage, And it was made on the basis of something that was less than a full moral argument and more than mere reflex, something that belonged to the deepest layer of who he was, the layer that Uncle Ben had spent years cultivating, and that had been reinforced by every choice Peter had made since the warehouse in Queens. He was not a killer. He had chosen, before he had the power to kill, to be something other than that, and the choice had been made at a level of the self that his grief and his rage could not reach to revise. Norman's death came through his own technology, through the glider he had ridden throughout his career as the Green Goblin, turned against him in the chaos of the final moments of their confrontation, and the irony of this outcome, which might in other circumstances have felt like poetic justice, felt in the immediate aftermath of Gwen's death like nothing in particular. The city that Spider-Man had spent years protecting continued its ordinary, magnificent, indifferent life, and Peter moved through it carrying something that would never fully leave him, the specific grief of a love lost at the moment of its fullest expression, and the specific guilt of a hero who had done everything right and arrived at the worst possible outcome, and the specific knowledge that both of these things were true simultaneously, and that neither cancelled the other, and that he would spend the rest of his life learning to carry them both. Gwen Stacy did not disappear from Peter Parker's life when she died on the bridge. She remained, as the people we have loved most completely always remain, as a presence in the interior landscape, as a voice in the conscience, as a standard against which subsequent choices are measured and found adequate or wanting. Her father had asked Peter to take care of her, and Peter had failed at this in the most complete way available to failure, and the asking and the failing and the love that had existed between the two of them in the space between these events remained as true and as permanent as anything else in his life. She had been real. She had loved him. He had loved her. The bridge had not changed any of these things. It had only added to them the unbearable weight of what had been lost, and the unbearable persistence of the man who had to continue living inside that weight and find, somehow, reasons to keep swinging. The bridge receded into the past the way that the worst things recede, not by becoming smaller but by becoming structural, by being absorbed into the architecture of a life that had to continue, regardless of what it now contained. Peter Parker kept moving, kept swinging, kept showing up to the places where Spider-Man was needed, and performing the functions that Spider-Man existed to perform, and he did this with the particular determination of someone who has decided that continuance is itself a form of honouring what has been lost, that the alternative to continuing is a kind of second death that the first death does not justify and would not have wanted. He grieved, and he continued, and he carried both of these activities simultaneously in the way that human beings carry the things they cannot put down, with the whole body, with every step, with a quality of effort that is invisible to observers because its primary expression is simply the act of remaining present in a life that has been made immeasurably heavier. What observers could see, what the people around him noticed and worried about and could not quite find the language to address, was the exhaustion. Not the ordinary exhaustion of someone managing a difficult period, the kind that rest resolves and time moderates, but the deeper exhaustion of someone who has been operating at the limit of their available resources for long enough that the limit itself has shifted, that what was once the edge of capacity has become the new baseline, and that the recovery periods are never quite sufficient to restore what the expenditure has consumed. Peter had always been tired in ways that his civilian life could not account for. After the bridge, the tiredness had a different quality, heavier and more pervasive, located not just in the body but in whatever part of a person generates the will to continue engaging with the world as though it still contains things worth protecting. He still paid rent. This is the detail that gets lost in the larger narrative, the one that the heroic literature of Spider-Man tends to elide in favour of the more dramatic material, the battles and the losses and the moral crucibles. He still paid rent, and the rent was due on the first of every month, and the amount it represented was an amount that Peter Parker, freelance photographer and part-time science student, was perpetually in the process of assembling from sources that were inadequate to the requirement and subject to disruption by the same activities that made the requirement harder to meet. The financial life of Peter Parker ran beneath every chapter of his story like a low, persistent note, present in the texture of every decision he made about his time and his energy and his priorities, and it deserves to be examined with the same seriousness that the more elevated aspects of his experience receive, because it was as real and as consequential as any of them. The Parker household had never been wealthy. This was established early in Peter's life and remained a constant across its entire duration, a feature of his circumstances so fundamental that it shaped his understanding of the world before he had the vocabulary to name what it was shaping. Ben Parker had worked steadily and without complaint at the kinds of jobs that keep households functioning without ever generating the surplus that creates genuine financial security, and May had managed the domestic economy of their modest home with the particular ingenuity of someone who has learned to make careful use of what is available, because the available has always been limited. There was love in that house, abundant and genuine, but there was also the specific daily texture of a family that counted things, that made choices based on cost in ways that families with adequate resources do not have to make, that experienced the approach of unexpected expenses not as inconvenience but as genuine threat. Peter had understood this from an early age, understood it in the way children understand the emotional climate of their households before they understand its causes, felt the slight tension that accompanied certain conversations about bills and the specific relief that accompanied others about unexpected small windfalls, and absorbed into himself the knowledge that money was something to be taken seriously, that its absence created real suffering, and that the people he loved were vulnerable in this particular way as they were vulnerable in others. The specific economics of the Daily Bugle arrangement deserve examination because they capture something essential about the particular quality of Peter's financial life that went beyond simple poverty into something more structurally peculiar. Spider-Man was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most photographically compelling figures in New York City, a costumed hero with a distinctive visual identity who regularly engaged in activities of genuine public interest in locations that were difficult to access without the kind of abilities that only Spider-Man possessed. Photographs of Spider-Man in action were genuinely valuable to a newspaper whose business model depended on compelling visual content, and Peter Parker was the only photographer in the city who could reliably obtain them, for reasons that Jameson never fully investigated. Because the investigation might have produced answers that complicated his preferred narrative about the wall crawler. This gave Peter a degree of leverage in his relationship with the Bugle that a less scrupulous person might have exploited to considerably greater financial advantage. He did not exploit it, both because his character was not oriented toward exploitation, and because any negotiation that drew too much attention to the question of how he obtained his photographs risked attention that he could not afford. He accepted what Jameson offered, which was fair by the standards of freelance news photography without being generous, and he supplemented this income with whatever other work was available to a young man of his skills and his irregular schedule: science tutoring, technical writing, the occasional consulting work that his genuine expertise in chemistry and physics made him qualified for, none of which added up in most months, to the kind of financial stability that allowed for planning or saving, or any of the other activities associated with economic security. The costs of being Spider-Man, separate from the costs of being Peter Parker, were real and recurring, and largely invisible to anyone outside the situation. Web fluid was the most consistent expense, a chemical compound that required specific materials to synthesize, materials that had to be purchased and stored and used, with a regularity that reflected the frequency of his patrols and the typical demands of the confrontations they involved. A significant evening of crime fighting could consume web fluid at a rate that represented a meaningful percentage of a week's grocery budget, and the materials required for its replacement were not available at the corner pharmacy. They required the kind of specialized suppliers whose prices reflected the specialized nature of their inventory, and Peter dealt with these suppliers in the same careful way he dealt with everything else that had to be managed without attracting the wrong kind of attention. The costume itself was a recurring cost that presented its own particular set of complications. The material needed to be durable enough to survive the physical demands of superhero combat, while remaining flexible enough for the full range of movement that web swinging required, and it needed to be obtainable and workable by a person without access to a professional tailor or a material science laboratory, though the latter constraint had eased somewhat as Peter's scientific education had progressed. Damage to the costume during confrontations was common, ranged from minor tears that could be repaired to significant structural failures that required partial or complete reconstruction, and every reconstruction represented both a financial cost and a time investment that competed with the other demands on Peter's extremely limited resources of both. The medical dimension of the financial picture was perhaps the most quietly consequential element of the entire situation. Peter's still the specific intersection of love and financial anxiety that had been a feature of his relationship with his aunt for as long as he could remember. There was a period, not brief and not comfortable, during which Peter was simultaneously paying for May's medication, maintaining his web fluid supplies, covering his share of shared living costs, and eating less than was optimal for someone whose enhanced metabolism required substantially more caloric input than an ordinary person of his size and age. The enhanced metabolism was not a small thing. The spider bite had reconfigured Peter's body in ways that made extraordinary physical demands on it, and those demands needed to be met through food, ordinary unglamorous grocery store food, in quantities that a budget under significant pressure from multiple other directions struggled to provide. There were weeks when the arithmetic of his finances produced answers that required choosing which of his obligations to partially defer, and the choosing was always painful, and always produced its own particular anxiety about which of the deferred obligations would generate consequences he could not manage when the deferral came due. The irony that Jonah Jameson identified with such frequency and such satisfaction in his editorials that Spider-Man was pursuing personal glory and financial gain through his heroic activities was almost perfectly inverted from the actual situation, which was that Spider-Man's heroic activities were a primary driver of Peter Parker's financial difficulties, requiring expenditures that reduced the income available for ordinary life, while simultaneously making it harder to generate that income through reliable conventional employment. The man whose image sold newspapers and whose activities generated significant advertising revenue for the Daily Bugle was having difficulty paying his electric bill, and the connection between these two facts was both direct and completely invisible to everyone who might have been in a position to find it remarkable. What Peter never did, across all the years of this financial difficulty, was allow it to become the reason for any compromise of his heroic responsibilities. There were opportunities, presented with varying degrees of explicitness over the years, to profit more directly from his abilities, to accept the kinds of payments that certain people with certain agendas were willing to offer in exchange for specific applications of Spider-Man's capabilities. He declined them, consistently and without extended deliberation, not because he was indifferent to money, but because he understood, in the way he understood everything essential, that the moment he began calculating the financial value of his heroic decisions was the moment those decisions stopped being heroic and started being something else, something that would have made Ben Parker's quiet moral clarity unavailable to him as a standard against which to measure his choices. The dignity with which Peter Parker managed his financial life was not the dignity of someone who is comfortable, who has resolved the question of material security and can therefore afford the luxury of principle. It was the dignity of someone who has decided, in conditions of genuine difficulty and with full awareness of the alternatives, that principle matters more than comfort, that the obligations created by his abilities extend to the obligation to maintain the integrity of those abilities as tools of genuine service rather than instruments of personal advantage. He paid his rent late sometimes. He ate poorly sometimes. He deferred necessary expenses and managed without things that most people his age considered basic requirements. He did these things without self-pity and without resentment, because the alternative was to become someone other than who he had decided to be on the night the warehouse taught him what his powers were actually for. This, as much as anything else in his story, is what the financial reality of Peter Parker's life reveals about his character. Not that he was poor, though he often was, and not that his poverty was heroic, because poverty is not inherently heroic and should not be romanticized, but that he was someone who knew the price of what he had chosen and paid it, month after month and year after year, with the same quiet commitment that he brought to everything else that his life as Spider-Man demanded of him. The web shooters needed to be refilled, the rent needed to be paid, the city needed to be protected. He did all three, in whatever order the month required, and he found, in the doing of all three simultaneously and indefinitely, not romance or nobility, but simply the ordinary texture of a life organized around the things that mattered most, which had never, in his accounting, included the question of whether the accounting was comfortable. the financial ledger of Peter Parker's life. With all its careful management and recurring shortfalls and quiet dignities, existed in parallel with another kind of accounting that no spreadsheet could contain and no budget could address. The accounting that the body keeps on its own terms, in its own language, independent of whatever arrangements the mind makes with the world. A person can decide to absorb financial difficulty with grace and without complaint, and Peter did this, genuinely and consistently, as has been described. The body does not make the same kind of decision. The body simply records what happens to it, keeps its own meticulous and entirely honest register of impact and stress and accumulated damage, and presents its findings not in any organized or scheduled way, but whenever the weight of the record becomes sufficient to demand attention. Peter's body had been keeping this register since the day the radioactive spider changed everything about how he moved through the world, and the register, across the years of his career as Spider-Man, had grown into something substantial, something that the enhanced healing and the extraordinary physical resilience of his transformed physiology could manage but could not erase. It begins with the simple fact of impact, which is the most basic and most constant element of Spider-Man's physical experience and the one that civilian life offers no adequate analogy for. To swing between buildings on lines of webbing at the speeds that Peter routinely travelled was to subject the body to forces that had no precedent in ordinary human movement. Centrifugal pressures at the bottom of each arc, sudden directional changes that demanded instantaneous muscular response. The occasional miscalculation or unexpected obstacle that converted forward momentum into collision with surfaces that did not yield the way a trained athlete's landing mat yields. Peter absorbed these forces with the enhanced durability that the spider bite had provided, and his body processed them in the accelerated way that his transformed physiology processed everything, and the bruising that would have kept an ordinary person immobile for days resolved in Peter's case within hours. But resolved is not the same as absent. The hour still existed. The bruising was still present in them, still registered in the body's honest accounting, still shaped how he carried himself through the other activities of those hours, the school corridors and the bugle offices and the kitchen table with May, where he ate his dinner with the carefully managed posture of someone who has learned to conceal pain through the application of deliberate attention. The ribs were the most frequent and most inconvenient of the recurring injuries, because ribs are not things that can be easily worked around in a life that requires the full range of thoracic movement, requires deep breathing during sustained physical exertion, requires the capacity to absorb contact without audible response. Peter cracked ribs with a regularity that, had it been visible to anyone in his civilian life, would have generated immediate and serious concern. In the context of his actual life, it generated careful breath management and the specific discipline of maintaining normal vocal patterns when May hugged him, and the pressure of her arms landed on something that was in the process of healing. He became expert at this particular concealment, at producing the warm and natural response that a hug deserves, while the interior of his chest was doing something considerably more complicated than the exterior suggested. The expertise itself was a kind of cost, the ongoing expenditure of attention that concealment required, attention that could have gone elsewhere and went here instead, into the daily performance of physical wholeness. Beyond the ribs were the shoulders, which bore an enormous proportion of the mechanical load of web swinging and wall crawling and the specific physical demands of combat, with opponents whose strength and methods varied considerably, but whose consistent effect on Peter's shoulder joints was a kind of cumulative conversation between applied force and biological structure, that the biological structure was always eventually required to answer. The answer took the form of inflammation and stiffness, and the particular ache of joints that have been asked to perform at extremes of their range, under load for extended periods. And while Peter's healing addressed this the way it addressed everything, the addressing took time, and the time was spent inside a body that was reminding him, with characteristic physical honesty, that the conversation had occurred. The hands deserved their own examination in this counting, because the hands were the most constant interface between Spider-Man's body and the physical world he moved through, the surfaces he clung to, the web lines he fired, the opponents he grappled with, the weight he supported and redirected and occasionally, when necessary, applied with the full force of everything the spider bite had made available. The palms of Peter Parker's hands, had anyone examined them with sufficient attention, told a story of sustained extraordinary use, of a relationship with friction and grip and adhesion that ordinary human hands were not designed for, and that Peter's transformed hands managed through mechanisms that his scientific understanding could describe, but that the sensation of inhabiting was beyond any description's reach. They were strong, his hands genuinely and almost incomprehensibly strong in the context of a person of his apparent size and build, and they were also, beneath the strength, attentive in a way that hands become when they have been relied upon for years as instruments of precision and care, when they have had to modulate between the force required to climb a building's exterior and the force appropriate for handing a grocery bag to an elderly neighbour without causing alarm. The sensory dimensions of his transformed body presented their own category of ongoing physical experience that occupied a space between gift and burden with a fluidity that varied by context, and that Peter had spent years learning to navigate. The spider sense was the most immediately useful of his enhanced perceptions, the biological alarm system that had saved his life on more occasions than he could count, and he had developed over time a sophisticated relationship with its signals, a fluency in the language of warning it spoke that allowed him to distinguish between the background noise of ordinary environmental information and the specific quality of alert that meant something genuinely dangerous was approaching. But fluency had not made the sense quiet. It had simply made its constant activity manageable, and manageable was different from comfortable, was different from the experience of moving through the world without a perpetual sensory accompaniment that registered everything in the environment as potential information requiring assessment. In the densely populated environments of his civilian life, classrooms and newsrooms and crowded city streets, the spider sense operated at a level of background activation that a less practiced person would have found overwhelming, processing the movements and intentions and physical proximities of hundreds of people simultaneously, and translating this processing into a continuous low-level awareness that sat just below the threshold of active attention. Peter had learned to keep this awareness at the threshold level most of the time, neither ignoring it nor being consumed by it, maintaining the functional equivalent of the alertness that an experienced driver maintains on a busy highway, present enough to respond to anything significant and sufficiently habituated to the ordinary to avoid exhausting itself on the unremarkable. The cognitive cost of maintaining this calibration, year after year, in environments of varying complexity and varying threat level, was real and ongoing and impossible to fully account for in any assessment of his daily energy expenditure. The other enhanced senses, the acuity of vision and hearing and smell that the bite had given him, created their own management challenges in the civilian world, challenges that bore no resemblance to the enhancement they represented in the field. In the field, being able to hear a conversation happening 3 floors above him, or to detect through smell the specific chemical signature of an approaching threat, was straightforwardly valuable, providing information that improved his effectiveness and protected his safety. In a high school classroom or a newspaper office or a crowded restaurant, these same capacities provided information that was not useful, could not be acted upon, and required active suppression to prevent it from interfering with the activities and conversations that his civilian life demanded. The perfume that a colleague had applied too liberally, the argument happening in an office down the hall, the specific frequencies of fluorescent lighting that his enhanced auditory processing detected as a constant low-frequency hum beneath the surface of every indoor environment he inhabited. These were not threats, not useful intelligence, simply sensory data that his transformed body insisted on receiving and that his mind had to manage without assistance from any system designed for the purpose. The exhaustion that resulted from this perpetual sensory management, layered on top of the physical demands of regular patrols and the sleep deprivation inherent in a life organized around activities that could not be performed in daylight without significant additional complications, had a quality that Peter came to recognize as distinct from ordinary tiredness, in the way that chronic conditions are distinct from acute ones, not by being more intense at any given moment, but by being more pervasive, more present in the texture of every waking hour, more resistant to the ordinary remedies that tiredness responds to. Sleep, when he got enough of it, which was not always, helped but did not fully resolve the accumulated deficit. Rest helped, but did not restore what sustained overextension had cost. The body kept its honest accounting regardless of how much Peter might prefer a different set of numbers, and what the accounting showed, across the years of his career, was a register of expenditure that his extraordinary physiology, could sustain without catastrophic failure, but could not sustain without cost. It was against this background of sustained physical complexity that the symbiote arrived in Peter's life, and its arrival needs to be understood in this context to be fully understood at all, because the specific appeal it offered was not primarily about the enhanced capabilities it provided, though those were real and significant. The specific appeal was simpler and more intimate than enhanced capabilities. It was the offer of ease, of a physical experience that required less management, that compensated for limitations instead of demanding that limitations be managed around, that made the body's relationship with its extraordinary demands feel, for the first time in Peter's experience of that body, genuinely uncomplicated. The costume that Peter acquired, which presented itself initially as a remarkable piece of alien technology and revealed itself gradually as something categorically different, responded to his physical state in real time, adapting to his injuries, reinforcing his weak points, generating web fluid from its own substance so that he did not have to monitor and replenish his supply, conforming so perfectly to his body's movements that the boundary between costume and body became progressively less clear. For someone who had spent years managing the physical demands of his heroic life through discipline and attention and the constant application of will to the problem of maintaining function in a body that was perpetually being asked to do more than rest aloud, this responsiveness was not just practically useful, it was, at a level that went beneath practical assessment into something more visceral and more personal, a profound relief. The symbiote understood, or operated as though it understood, the specific architecture of Peter's physical experience in ways that were initially explicable as technological sophistication, and became, as the weeks of their association extended, increasingly difficult to explain on purely technological grounds. It knew where he hurt before he had consciously registered the hurting. It compensated for the asymmetries that accumulated injury had created in his movement patterns, the slight favouring of one shoulder, the tendency to protect a previously cracked rib even after the rib had healed, the micro-adjustments that the body makes around its history of damage and that even enhanced healing does not fully eliminate. It addressed these things quietly, without requiring his attention, and the experience of moving through the world without having to manage them was so different from his ordinary physical experience that it took him some time to recognize how different it was. How much of his perpetual background effort had been going into exactly this management. This recognition, when it arrived, was important not primarily as information about the symbiote, but as information about himself, about the extent to which the physical demands of his life had become normalized to the point of invisibility, about how much he had been carrying without noticing the carrying because the carrying had been continuous for long enough to feel like simply the nature of things. The symbiote's presence made the carrying visible by temporarily relieving it, in the same way that the removal of a chronic low-grade pain reveals the extent to which adaptation to that pain had been shaping behavior in ways that had ceased to feel like adaptation and had started feeling like simply how things were. The nights during which the symbiote took his body on its independent patrols, using Peter's sleeping form as its vehicle for activities that Peter had not chosen and would not have chosen, represented the most fundamental violation of bodily autonomy that his career had produced, more invasive in a certain sense than any of the physical injuries he had sustained, because those injuries had been imposed from outside and had been metabolized by a body that remained, throughout its healing, fully his own. The symbiote's nocturnal use of his body was something different, was the experience of being inhabited rather than hurt, of waking to a body that had been somewhere and done things, and was tired in ways that his own choices had not produced, tired in the way of someone who had been working while they believed themselves to be sleeping, who had been spending energy from an account they thought was being replenished. Mary Jane's perception that something was wrong, her recognition that the man in the black costume was not quite the man she knew, even when he was standing in front of her, demonstrated both her perceptiveness and the symbiote's essential inaccuracy as a mimic of Peter's interior life. It could reproduce his physical capabilities and approximate his behavioral patterns and access his memories for navigational and tactical purposes, but it could not reproduce the specific quality of his presence, the particular way his attention organized itself around the people he loved, the texture of his humor, the precise calibrations of his moral instincts that were the products of his specific history and his specific character, and that could not be replicated by any organism, however sophisticated, that had not lived that history and formed that character through the decades of experience that had produced them. The separation from the symbiote, accomplished with the assistance of sonic vibration that caused the organism genuine pain and that caused Peter genuine distress in the causing, was physically demanding in a way that bore a genuine resemblance to withdrawal. The body accustomed to a supplementary system of support suddenly required to manage without it, feeling the absence of the ease that the supplement had provided as a kind of deficit, as the return of demands that had been temporarily relieved and that now reasserted themselves with the additional weight of contrast. He had known, for those weeks of their association, what it felt like to inhabit his body without the accumulated physical cost of his career, and now he knew again what it felt like to inhabit it with that cost, and the knowing again had the specific quality of a loss layered on top of all the other losses, minor in comparison to most of them, but real in its own register. What Peter understood in the aftermath of the symbiote, understanding that he had not quite possessed before the experience and could not quite unlearn after it, was something about the relationship between physical experience and identity, about how the body's ongoing accommodation of its own history creates a continuity of self that is not merely biological but deeply personal. The symbiote had offered him relief from this accommodation, had offered him a body that did not carry its history and its movement patterns and its healing processes and its calibrated sensory management, and he had discovered, through the experience of that relief and its eventual removal, that the accommodation was not only a cost but also a form of integrity, that the body that bore the marks of his choices and his losses and his years of service was genuinely and irreducibly his, and that its tiredness was the tiredness of someone who had used themselves in the service of something that mattered, which was a different kind of tiredness from all the kinds that have no such account to give of themselves. He returned to the red and blue costume with this understanding in him, returned to the web fluid cartridges that needed monitoring, and the shoulder that ached in cold weather, and the spider sense that never fully quieted, and the sleep that was never quite sufficient, and he carried all of it forward into the continuation of a career that the body's honest accounting confirmed was extracting a genuine and ongoing price, and he paid the price, as he paid all the prices his life required, not without awareness of the paying, but without the paying becoming the reason to stop. The body's honest accounting, with all its unscheduled presentations of accumulated cost, existed within a life that contained more than physical demands, more than financial pressures and sensory management, and the ongoing discipline of concealment. It existed within relationships, and the relationships were themselves a form of accounting, a different kind of register kept in a different kind of currency, one whose entries were made not in the language of impact and healing, but in the language of presence and absence, of what was offered and what was withheld and what was lost because the offering had come too late, or the withholding had gone on too long. Of all the relationships that shaped Peter Parker's life from the inside, the one with Harry Osborn occupied a particular position in this register, not because it was the deepest love of his life, though it was a genuine and lasting love, but because it was the relationship in which the cost of the secret was most continuously and most completely borne by someone other than Peter himself, someone who needed things from his closest friend that his closest friend was structurally prevented from providing, and who suffered the specific consequences of that prevention without ever understanding its cause. Harry James Osborn had arrived in Peter's life at Empire State University with the particular social confidence of someone who has grown up inside wealth and privilege long enough that these things have become invisible to him, not as performance or affectation, but as simply the texture of existing. The natural atmosphere of a person who has never had to consider whether the room he is entering will receive him well. He was generous, genuinely and without calculation, in the way that people are generous when generosity has never required them to calculate its cost, and his warmth toward Peter from the early stages of their acquaintance had a quality of authenticity that Peter, accustomed to the more conditional social environments of his previous experience, recognized and valued immediately. Harry wanted a real friend. He had the resources to attract many kinds of people into his orbit, and had learned, with a perceptiveness that his social ease sometimes obscured, to distinguish between people who wanted his proximity for what it provided and people who simply wanted him. Peter, who had no use for what Harry's wealth and connections could provide, and who related to him as simply another young man navigating the same institutional environment, fell clearly and recognisably into the second category, and Harry responded to this with a gratitude that was disproportionate to what Peter had actually done, but entirely proportionate to what Harry had needed. The friendship that developed between them across the university years had the specific texture of friendships formed in early adulthood, between people whose differences are complementary rather than competitive. Harry was socially fluent where Peter was awkward, comfortable with wealth, where Peter was anxious about money, oriented toward the present moment where Peter was constitutionally inclined toward consequence and implication. Peter was intellectually rigorous where Harry was impressionistic, morally serious where Harry was more inclined toward accommodation, attentive to the people around him in ways that Harry, for all his genuine warmth, sometimes failed to be because his own needs were sufficiently demanding to occupy most of his available attention. They balanced each other in the way of good friendships, each providing the other with access to qualities and perspectives that their own nature did not naturally generate, and the balance felt, for the years during which it was undisturbed by the larger forces gathering around both of their lives, genuinely sustaining. Norman Osborn was the fault line beneath this friendship from the beginning, the geological instability that the surface warmth of the relationship concealed, and that would eventually produce the ruptures that neither Peter nor Harry could entirely prevent or repair. Norman's presence in Harry's life was the defining wound of Harry's psychology, the central fact around which everything else in his interior world was organised. And it was a wound that had been inflicted not through cruelty in the conventional sense, but through the specific damage that a certain kind of love does when it is conditional and inconsistent and always slightly beyond reach. Norman loved Harry. Peter believed this, and the evidence supports the belief, in the complicated way that people love when their capacity for love has been distorted by their own psychological history and their own ambitions and their own needs. The love was real, and it was insufficient, and it was organised around what Harry represented to Norman's vision of his legacy, rather than around who Harry actually was. And Harry had spent his entire life trying to reconcile these two things, trying to be enough for a father whose definition of the enough kept shifting in response to criteria that Harry could never quite identify in time to meet them. Peter had watched this dynamic across the years of their friendship, with the particular helplessness of someone who understands clearly what is happening to another person, and lacks the standing or the information to intervene in a way that would actually help. He could offer Harry his presence and his friendship, and he did consistently and without reservation, but the wound that Norman's parenting had created in Harry was not one that friendship could reach, was located in a place that only a different version of the father-son relationship could have addressed. And a different version of that relationship was not available. What Peter could do was be there, reliably and genuinely there, and this was not nothing, was in fact a considerable thing, but it was not the thing Harry most needed, and Peter knew this, and the knowledge sat in him with the particular weight of things that are clearly understood and cannot be acted upon. Harry's drug use, which emerged during the university years as both symptom and attempted remedy, was the first visible expression of how completely the pressure of Norman's expectations and Norman's love had organised Harry's interior life around needs that were not being met. The specific substances Harry turned to offered, for the hours of their effect, something that his ordinary existence did not, which was relief from the chronic low-grade anxiety of being Norman Osborn's son, in a world where being Norman Osborn's son carried both enormous privilege and the specific psychological cost of a conditional love that made the privilege feel perpetually provisional. Peter recognised the drug use for what it was with the accuracy of someone who understood Harry's inner life as well as anyone outside it could, and he tried to address it with the tools available to him, which were primarily the tools of friendship, of conversation and presence, and the consistent offering of a relationship that made no demands on Harry to be anything other than what he was. These tools were genuine, and they were not sufficient, and Peter's recognition of their insufficiency added another entry to the register of things he carried that he could not put down. He could not tell Harry the things that might have actually helped, could not explain the full context of Norman's activities and the specific shape of the darkness that surrounded them, could not offer the information that might have helped Harry locate his father's behaviour within a framework that made a different kind of sense than the one Harry was using. The framework Harry was using placed the responsibility for Norman's emotional unavailability somewhere in Harry himself, in some deficit of his own that he had never been able to identify and correct. And this framework was generating, in combination with the self-medication that was his primary coping strategy, a downward trajectory that Peter could observe and could not arrest. When Norman died, and the circumstances of his death were what they were, Peter's position became simultaneously more impossible and more essential. Harry grieved for his father with the full force of a love that had never been adequately reciprocated, and that now had no possibility of ever finding the resolution it had always been seeking. The conversation that would finally confirm that Norman had seen Harry clearly and loved what he saw, the moment of genuine mutual recognition that Harry had been waiting for his entire life, and that Norman's death had made permanently unavailable. This grief was enormous, and it was real, and it was complicated, in the way that grief for difficult parents is always complicated, by the anger that the love had never been simple enough to separate from, by the guilt that the anger generated, by the unresolved questions about what the relationship might eventually have become that now could never be answered. Peter held Harry through this grief with the same commitment he brought to everything he did for the people he loved, and he did so while carrying in parallel information that he could not share, information that would have rewritten the entire context of Harry's mourning if it had been available to him. Norman Osborn had been the Green Goblin. Norman Osborn had killed Gwen Stacy on the George Washington Bridge. Norman Osborn had known Peter's secret identity and used that knowledge as a weapon, and died in the process of attempting to use it again. These were facts that Peter carried, facts that had shaped some of the most significant events of Harry's life and of Peter's own, and he carried them in silence because the alternative, the revelation of the truth, would have required him to expose his own identity and to ask Harry to process, in the middle of his raw and immediate grief, the information that the father he was mourning had been responsible for the death of the woman Peter had loved, and for the specific shape of the last several years of Peter's life. The silence was chosen, as most of Peter's silences were chosen, out of genuine love and genuine protection, out of the assessment that Harry in his current state could not hold this information without being destroyed by it, and that the timing of revelation matters as much as the revelation itself. But silence chosen out of love still creates distance, and the distance it created between Peter and Harry in the period of Harry's grief was felt by both of them as a failure of the friendship's usual intimacy without either of them being able to locate its source, which was itself a product of the silence, a recursive effect of the secret on the relationship the secret was meant to protect. Harry's eventual discovery of his father's equipment and research, his gradual piecing together of the truth about Norman's double life, arrived not as a single revelation, but as an accumulation, over months and then years, of evidence that could not be explained by any framework except the one that Harry had always had access to, and had been unable to bring himself to apply because its implications were too large. When the framework finally assembled itself into something he could no longer deny, what Harry was left with was not the complete truth but a partial truth, a truth that included the existence of the Green Goblin identity without the full context of what that identity had done, and that included Spider-Man as the figure most associated with his father's death, without the context that would have explained why Spider-Man had been present at the moments of Norman's most significant criminal activities. The rage that developed in Harry towards Spider-Man was not irrational given what he knew, which is important to hold in understanding how Peter experienced it. Harry was not wrong that Spider-Man had been involved in the events surrounding his father's death. He was wrong about the nature and the meaning of that involvement, wrong in ways that the information he had available made almost inevitable, and Peter watched this wrongness develop and consolidate and direct itself toward his alter ego with the helplessness of someone who holds the correction and cannot offer it, who can see the precise location of the misunderstanding and cannot point to it without dismantling everything else that the pointing would require him to dismantle simultaneously. The chemical exposure that came with Harry's use of the Goblin formula accelerated and amplified what was already present in him, the grief and the rage and the need for resolution that ordinary means had not provided, in the way that the formula had always accelerated and amplified what was present in its users. Taking the existing psychological material and removing from it the moderating influences of ordinary judgment and social constraint. The Harry who emerged from this process was not a different person from the Harry Peter had known and loved across the years of their friendship. He was the same person with certain essential protections removed, with the pain that had always been present made directly and dangerously visible rather than managed and contained, with the love and the hurt and the need for his father's approval and the rage at everything that had prevented that approval from arriving, transformed into a mission that was simultaneously comprehensible and terrible. Peter's response to Harry's transformation into the new Green Goblin was shaped at every moment by the knowledge of who Harry was beneath the transformation, by the memory of the young man who had wanted a real friend and found one and had been genuinely capable, in his best moments, of the kind of uncomplicated generosity that makes a person irreplaceable in the lives of the people who love them. He fought Harry because Harry was dangerous and people needed to be protected from that danger, and he held back in ways that a purely tactical assessment would not have recommended. Pulled punches that he should not have pulled and sought conversations that the situation did not reward and continued, through encounters that were genuinely threatening to his physical safety, to speak to the person inside the Green Goblin costume as though that person was still accessible, as though the right combination of words and patience and the specific quality of love that had always characterized their friendship might still find its way through the formula's amplifications to something that remembered what they had been to each other. This was not strategic. It was not even fully rational, given what Harry was doing and what he was capable of doing. It was simply what love looks like when it refuses to be revised by circumstance, when it insists on addressing itself to the person rather than the threat, when it cannot bring itself to treat someone it has known and cared for as simply an obstacle to be neutralized rather than a human being in need of something that the obstacle presentation is a symptom of. Peter could not save Harry from the formula or from the grief or from the specific trajectory that Norman's legacy had set in motion decades before Harry had any agency in relation to it. What he could do was continue to show up to the encounters as himself, as the friend rather than the adversary, and this was not nothing, was in fact in the register of things that matter even when they do not produce the outcomes they are oriented toward. Considerable. Harry's final act, the choice to save Peter and the others, rather than complete the revenge that had organized his transformed psychology, came from the place that Peter had always been addressing himself to, the place where Harry Osborn rather than the Green Goblin made the decisions. It came, as such moments always come, at enormous cost. The formula's long-term effects on Harry's body, presenting their accounting at precisely the moment when he most needed his body to cooperate with the choice he had made. He died in a way that was, given everything that had preceded it, as much a restoration as a loss, the man Peter had known reasserting himself in the moment that mattered most, and making the choice that confirmed that the friendship had always been real, and that what Harry had been at his best was what Harry most deeply was, regardless of everything the formula and the grief and Norman's legacy had done to obscure it. Peter held him as he died and said the things that the situation called for, and that were also simply true, that he had always been his friend, that the friendship had been one of the sustaining things of his life, that he was sorry for all the distances the secret had created, for all the conversations they had not been able to have, for all the things that might have been different if the circumstances had allowed different choices. Harry's response, in the moments remaining to him, was the response of someone who had found his way back to himself in time to receive what was being offered, and to offer in return the forgiveness that Peter had not known he needed as badly as he did until it was given. The grief that followed was a grief Peter carried with a specific quality of completeness, because Harry had been the friend who had known Peter Parker across the full span of his adult life, who had witnessed the university years and the early career and the losses and the small triumphs and the ongoing management of a double life that Harry had never known was double, and whose absence now removed from Peter's world the one person who had been consistently present through all of it, who constituted in his very existence a form of continuity with the person Peter had been, before so much had been lost. He mourned Harry with the fullness that Harry deserved, which was considerable, and he carried forward what Harry's final act had demonstrated, which was that love, even love that has been distorted and damaged by forces larger than the people feeling it, tends, when given the chance, to find its way back to what it most essentially is. And so the web settles, gently, the way webs do in the quiet hours after the city has exhausted itself, and the streets below have grown still, and the only movement is the slow drift of things finding their natural resting place. We have travelled far tonight, through grief and love and the particular dignity of a life organised around the needs of others, through the hidden costs and the silent payments and the relationships that were shaped, always, by the tension between what could be offered and what had to be held back. We have sat with the weight that responsibility carries when it is genuine, when it comes not from obligation imposed from outside, but from the deepest understanding a person possesses of what their presence in the world is actually for. What Peter Parker knew, in the end, is something that belongs to all of us, that the choice to show up, to keep showing up, to place whatever we have in service of the people who need it, is not a diminishment but a definition. That love, even partial and complicated and constrained by circumstances beyond our choosing, is still love, still the most important thing, still the web that holds. Let that understanding settle into you now. Let the story rest. Let yourself rest. You have been held tonight by something true. Sleep well.